Chapter 15 of The Cruise of the Esmeralda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Dave Wills. The Cruise of the Esmeralda by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 15. We arrive at the Treasure Island. During the succeeding watch, I had leisure to take a careful mental review of Joe's story, and the conclusion at which I arrived was that the man Moore, having failed in his endeavour to seduce the original crew of the Esmeralda from their duty, had, on his arrival at Sydney, no sooner recognized the probability of their desertion, which, for aught I knew to the contrary, he might very possibly have contributed to bring about, than he must have devoted himself to the task of collecting the party of men whose wiles I had now to circumvent. What a patient, crafty fellow the man had proved himself to be! It really appeared as though he must have had, almost from the outset of the voyage, some suspicion as to the character of the cryptogram over which he had seen me puzzling so often. Or might he not have gathered its nature from a chance word or two overheard while I had been discussing the subject with Sir Edgar? For he no sooner became aware in a general way of its contents than he was ready with a plan by which to turn the adventure to his own advantage. He was persevering too, for that plan had no sooner failed than he must have gone to work to formulate another, so skilfully devised and so carefully carried through that, but for Joe's devoted fidelity, it must have infallibly succeeded. Indeed, I felt by no means satisfied that they would not succeed even now. True, their designs, as revealed to Joe, might be very easily frustrated, but there was an unpleasant doubt in my mind as to the bona fide of that revelation. I could scarcely believe that men who had already exhibited such indisputable proof of extreme caution and steadfast self-control could be so easily imposed upon, as they appeared to have been, by Joe. What if they had seen through his devices, and had suspected his intentions? Would they not, in that case, have realized that our suspicions were aroused? And might they not have merely feigned to have fallen into Joe's trap, and have confided to him a purely fictitious statement of their plans, concocted for the express purpose of throwing us off our guard and leading us astray? Taking into account the deep guile that had prompted them to adopt and consistently maintain a course of the most orderly and irreproachable behavior as the most likely means of blinding me to and averting the faintest suspicion of their nefarious designs, I could not help feeling that such a line of action on their part was only too probable, and in casting about in my mind for some effectual method of subverting their plans, I fully realized that I should have to take this contingency into consideration, while preparing also a counterplot to that revealed by the man Rogers to Joe. Of one thing and one thing only could I be certain, which was that nobody, not even myself, knew the amount of the treasure, and it appeared to me that upon this fact must I base my plans. These reflections, given above in a very condensed form, fully occupied my mind during the first hour and a half of my watch, and were only interrupted by the appearance in the eastern quarter of that first faint paling of the darkness which heralded the dawn of a new day. This temporarily diverted my thoughts into a new channel, for upon solving the enigma of the cryptogram, my first act had been to consult a chart of the Pacific, with the resulting discovery that no such island as that referred to in the St. Ledger document was to be found upon it. Now, the ship's position on the previous noon, and her run since then, was such that if the morning happened to break clear, the island ought to be just visible, right ahead, at daybreak, provided, of course, that the man who secreted the treasure had made no mistake in his calculations. On the one hand, I thought it probable that, considering the important issues at stake, the utmost care would be taken to verify the position of the island beyond all possibility of error, while, on the other, was the curious fact that no such island, not even a rock, or indeed shoal water, appeared on the chart in the position indicated. This circumstance, coupled with my knowledge of the imperfect character of the instruments in use by navigators of the period at which the cryptogram had been written, caused me now to experience no little curiosity and anxiety as to what the approaching daylight might reveal. I was not to be left long in suspense. We were in the tropics, where the light comes and goes with a rush, a few minutes only intervening between broad day and deepest night. The first faint streak of scarcely perceptible pallor along the verge of the eastern horizon on our starboard bow lengthened and widened and grew more pronounced, even as I gazed upon it, until it became a broad segment of cold, colourless light, insensibly melting out of the circumscribing darkness. Then a faint, delicate tone of softest primrose began to steal through it, quickly strengthening and brightening as the light spread upwards and right and left, paling the stars one by one, until they dwindled away and vanished in the soft, rich blue that was swiftly chasing the darkness across the sky. Anon, a warm, rich, rosy flush began to pervade the primrose tones of the eastern horizon, against which the level line of the ocean's marge cut sharply in tones of deepest indigo, while overhead the brightening blue was delicately mottled with a whole archipelago of thin, fleecy cloudlets, pink-tinged and bordered along their lowest edges with purest gold, that were mysteriously floating into view, apparently from illimitable space. Then, from that point on the horizon, where the deepening rose colour glowed most brilliantly, up shot a single white ray perpendicularly towards the zenith, narrow and well defined where it sprang up from the horizon, and broadening as it soared aloft until it became lost amongst the lowest tier of clouds, now deeply tinged with dyes of richest crimson. This single ray had scarcely made itself apparent ere it was followed by others, radiating fanwise from the same spot, and in another instant a spark of golden flame flashed across the sea from the horizon at the point of junction of the rays, tinging the small wave crests in its wake with ruddy gold that deepened first into a line and then into a broad path of shimmering golden radiance as the burning rim of the sun soared slowly out of the purple sea. At the same instant, the man who had the lookout and who had stationed himself on the topgallant forecastle, right in the eyes of the ship, turned sharply round, facing the poop, and reported, "Land ho! Right ahead!" I had been so completely absorbed in contemplation of the magnificent spectacle of the sunrise that, for the moment, I had entirely forgotten the island and everything connected with it. But the cry of the lookout brought it back to my mind with a flash, and moving to the mizzen rigging and springing upon a hen-coop, I directed my gaze straight ahead, with my hand over my eyes to shield them from the dazzle of the sun. Yes, there it was, undoubtedly, a faint pinkish-grey shape right over the starboard cathead as I then stood, a low hummock on the left with a hill next to it, the outline of which, even at that distance, bore a striking resemblance to a man's nose, the upper lip on the right of it showing just clear of the horizon. Yes, there was the treasure island beyond all question. The next point to be determined was whether the treasure still lay buried there, and if so, how was I to obtain and retain possession of it? Of one thing I felt morally certain, which was that as soon as the men felt assured that the whole of the treasure was on board, they would take the ship from me, either by force or guile, if they could. It was of course open to me to make a fight for it, if I chose. But even assuming that I could reckon upon Sir Edgar's assistance, as I felt sure I could, that would make only 4 of us to oppose 11 men, who, I had no manner of doubt, would prove as resolute and determined in a stand-up fight as they had already shown themselves to be in the pursuit of their organized plans. The odds were nearly 3 to 1 against. Opposed to these, with, for our antagonists, resolute men whose knowledge of the consequences that must inevitably follow upon an unsuccessful attempt at piracy would nerve them to desperation, men who were unquestionably full of brute courage, and who, moreover, were doubtless as well armed as ourselves. Was I justified in entertaining the slightest hope of success in the event of my submitting the matter to the arbitrament of battle? The answer to this question was an unqualified no. If, then, it was hopeless to expect that a resort to force would enable me to retain my property, my freedom, and the freedom and property, aye, perhaps even the lives of those who in such a crisis as this would naturally look to me for the preservation of both, I must resort to guile. I mortally hate anything that in the slightest degree savours of deception, either in words or conduct, and have made it an invariable rule never to engage in any transaction needing the one or the other for its successful accomplishment. But here was a case in which I had no choice but to meet guile with guile. How was it to be done? Possibly, if the treasure happened to be in a compact form and easily accessible, Forbes, Joe, and myself might be able to secure it and convey it on board the ship, unknown to the men, while they were busily engaged in digging for it elsewhere. For, now that they were aware of its existence, it seemed to me that my best chance of success lay in employing them in the search, while taking care that none of them should find it. This would naturally lead them to the conclusion that, if my document were not an ingenious hoax, the treasure had already been discovered and secured by somebody else. This plan rather took my fancy. It was simple, feasible, and demanded no elaborate system of deception. The men would simply be set to dig upon a certain spot, and failing after a sufficiently exhaustive search to find anything, the digging would be abandoned, and they would be sent to various more or less distant parts of the island to cut sandalwood. The more I thought of it, the better I liked it, and when, later on during the afternoon, I found an opportunity to talk it over with Sir Edgar and Forbes, having previously related to them the substance of Joe's communication made to me during the middle watch, they agreed with me that, failing a better scheme, they saw no reason why it should not be successful. Sir Edgar, as I had anticipated, declared himself ready to act in any way that I might suggest, at a moment's notice, and now that he had had time to think over my former communication to him, and to grow accustomed to the idea of a coming contest, either of strength or wits, with the men, was as eager for the fray as a schoolboy is for the great cricket match of the year. Meanwhile, the wind had slightly freshened with the rising of the sun, and the ship was gliding along a taut bowline, under all plain sail, at a speed of about 6 knots, heading up about 1.5 points to windward of the northerly extremity of the island. We were approaching it from the southwest, the direction mentioned in my ancestor's cryptogram, and as we gradually rose it above the horizon, it was curious to note how exact a resemblance its outline bore to the profile of an upturned human face lying prone along the water. It was so striking that even the children remarked upon it, while, as for the men, they could scarcely remove their eyes from it, though their interest in the place was doubtless founded more upon the wealth they hoped to find upon it than upon its very singular appearance. I noted this morning, without appearing to do so, that there was a great deal of animated conversation going on upon the forecastle, accompanied by many stealthy glances towards the poop, while the late steward, now sweltering in the heat of the galley and of his hirsute disguise, was being continually appealed to. Now that I knew this man's secret, I was filled with astonishment that I had not immediately penetrated it, for, disguise his features as he might, he could not divest himself of the sly, stealthy way in which he used his eyes, nor of the noiseless, treacherous way in which he moved. I had noted these characteristics in him as far back as the day on which he had signed articles at Sydney. Yet, strange to say, familiar as they were to me, I had never for a moment suspected his identity, probably because when I happened to think of him at all, I assumed, as a matter of course, that he would naturally make the best of his way to the goldfields. Of course, since we had been at sea, his avocation as cook, that had confined him so closely to the galley that I had rarely seen him. And upon the rare occasions when he had been obliged to present himself in full view, my thoughts had usually been so busy upon other matters that I had taken little or no notice of him. Indeed, I shrewdly suspected that it was the comparative privacy of the galley that had led him to choose the disagreeable functions of ship's cook. All that day, until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we glided gently over a smooth, sparkling sea towards the island, noting with keen interest its various features as they imperceptibly resolved themselves out of the hazy blue tint that it had worn in the distance. The first marked change that occurred in its appearance was the breaking up of the flat silhouette into a series of softly shadowed markings, which indicated the shape of the hills and valleys, the slopes and ravines into which its surface was broken. Then, as the sun swept over it and round towards its western side, the light fell more strongly upon its hillsides. Its shadows grew deeper, and an all-pervading tone of green gave evidence of its exceeding fertility. Later still, the green became broken up into an infinite variety of shades, while the swelling rounded outlines that stood out from and yet indicated these multitudinous tints revealed the fact that the island was densely wooded to its very summit. By 6 bells in the afternoon we had neared it to within 3 miles, and we were enabled to see that its northern extremity was bold and precipitous, with naked, rocky cliffs, against the base of which the white surf chafed and roared with a ceaseless thunder that reached our ears even at that distance. The southwestern extremity, while as bold as the northern and almost as precipitous, was wooded right down to the water's edge, while from the lofty hill that in the distance had borne the appearance of a gigantic human nose, there was an irregular but general slope towards the southwestern shore, the entrance to the river mentioned in the cryptogram being clearly indicated by a low projecting point stretching southward from the bold cliffs marking the northern boundary of the island. Having satisfactorily made out the mouth of the river, I caused the helm to be shifted, and we bore away for our anchorage, which was reached about an hour later in a small estuary situate at the southern extremity of the island, affording perfect shelter from all winds from southwest round by north and east to southeast. By the time that the hands had got the canvas stowed, yards squared, running gear hauled taut and coiled down, and decks cleared up generally, it was 5 o'clock in the evening, and the shadows were already beginning to deepen on the western side of the ravine, along which the river flowed, while its eastern slopes were glowing brilliantly in the warm orange tones of the evening sunlight. It chanced that we had dropped our anchor at the precise spot which afforded us a clear view up the gently winding river for a distance of something like 1/4 of a mile, and never in all my life had I looked upon a more lovely scene than the one that then delighted our eyes. The so-called river was really a small arm of the sea, formed by a beautiful ravine, the bottom of which lay below sea level, dividing the southern portion of the island into 2 unequal parts. And as the western side of this ravine was high and steep, while the eastern side sloped gently but unevenly up from the water until it merged in the high ground beyond, the whole surface of the island being finely broken and densely wooded, the contrasting effects of brilliant sunshine and soft purple shadow, with the multitudinous tints and endless varieties of foliage, vividly marked in the foreground and insensibly merging into a delicious, soft, misty grey over the distant heights, combined to form a picture, the charming, fairy-like beauty of which it is as impossible to describe as it was entrancing to look upon. So lovely indeed was it that I found it hard to resist the entreaties of Lady Emily and her sister that I would lower a boat and take them for a short pull up the river before sunset. It was necessary, however, that our first visit to this lovely island paradise should be made with all due circumspection, for although no sign or trace of inhabitants had as yet been discovered, the place might, for all that, be peopled, and peopled too with cruel, bloodthirsty savages, for aught we could tell to the contrary. While, therefore, I was exceedingly anxious, for reasons of my own, to get a nearer peep at the place without a moment's unnecessary delay, I felt bound to point out to the ladies the absolute necessity for determining the question whether or not there were any inhabitants on the island, before exposing them to the possible risk of a landing. The objections to an immediate landing on the part of the ladies did not, however, apply with equal force in the case of us of the sterner sex. I therefore ordered the gig to be lowered, and, arming myself and each of the crew with a brace of loaded revolvers, prepared to make a preliminary trip as far as the creek referred to in the cryptogram. Upon hearing me give the order to get the boat ready, Sir Edgar asked permission to accompany me, and a few minutes later we shoved off and headed up the river. The waterway, as far up as we could see, maintained a tolerably even width of some 200 yards, the deepest water being close alongside the western shore, which was very steep and wooded clear down to the water's edge. Here, with the assistance of the hand-lead, I found a minimum depth of 2 fathoms, but the bottom was very uneven, and in a few places I found as much as 5 fathoms of water. From these depths the bottom seemed to slope pretty uniformly upward towards the opposite or eastern bank, the slope of which was much more gentle, a narrow margin of very fine white sand intervening between the water and the deep, rich, chocolate-coloured soil. The varieties of trees and shrubs were countless, ranging all the way from the smallest and most delicate flowering plants to magnificent forest giants, some of which must have towered at least 150 feet above the surface of the ground. Coconut palms formed a continuous fringe along the inner margin of the sandy beach, and beyond them were to be seen every imaginable species of tropical plant and tree, with foliage ranging in tint from the palest, most delicate green to deepest olive or purple-black. The waving fronds of the delicate feathery bamboo were everywhere visible, while creepers, in endless variety, trailed their long cord-like stems and gaudy blossoms in all directions. The still evening air vibrated with the continuous hissing buzz of countless millions of insects, and a few birds flitted noiselessly hither and thither among the gathering shadows, but no sign of a human form, not even the imprint of a footstep on the soft white sand, anywhere met my searching gaze. At a distance of about half a mile, or perhaps a little less, from the mouth of the river, the shore on our starboard hand merged into a low wooded point, round which we swept out of the main channel into a charming basin, some 2 miles wide, surrounded on every side by high land, sloping gently backward from the water's edge, and magnificently broken by deep precipitous ravines, some of which could be traced from the heart of the surrounding hills, clear down to the water's edge. The centre of the basin was occupied by an islet, roughly circular in shape, and about half a mile in diameter, as we discovered by pulling round it. This islet was the hiding place of the treasure, if the cryptogram was to be believed, and I accordingly inspected it as narrowly as the swiftly gathering darkness would permit, so that I might carry a tolerably distinct impression of it in my mind's eye, as an aid to the plan that I must now definitely form and arrange before the next sunrise. As may be supposed, I had by this time got the words of the cryptogram off by heart, and indeed had destroyed the translation lest it should fall into other hands. I therefore knew exactly what I had to look for as a mark to guide me to the hiding place of the treasure, and accordingly kept a very sharp lookout for the obelisk rock. There was only one rock to be seen on the islet that at all answered to this description, and that, so far as I could distinguish in the gloom, was a pointed needle-like mass, forming the summit of a steep cliff that rose precipitously from the water's edge and constituted the northern extremity of the islet. But on getting round to the other side, I was vexed and chagrined to find that the whole surface of the island on the southern side of this curious cliff was densely overgrown with trees and scrub, which would certainly have to be cut deeply into in order to arrive at the spot where the treasure was said to be buried. This condition of affairs, natural enough though it was, had somehow never occurred to me. I had fully expected to find the hiding place located in an open space that might be conveniently traversed in any and every direction, enabling the situation of the treasure to be determined by the simple process of measuring off 1,000 feet in a direction due south from the base of the obelisk rock. Possibly that might have been the condition of the islet at the period when the treasure was buried. Indeed, it very probably was. But there had been ample time for the ground to have become overgrown since then, and now it was so densely covered with vegetation that it would be hopeless to think of getting at the hiding place without the assistance of the men. And that meant the absolute overthrow of my plan to keep the recovery of the treasure a secret from them. What was to be done? I racked my brains during the whole of the long, hot, breathless night in a fruitless endeavour to devise some satisfactory way out of the difficulty, and arose from my sleepless bunk next morning with a splitting headache, and nothing in the shape of a settled plan beyond the determination to find a good long job for the men, the execution of which should afford me further time for reflection, and perhaps allow events to develop themselves. Acting then upon this resolution, I caused the gig to be brought alongside immediately after breakfast, and ordered the axes and shovels to be passed into her, at the same time issuing instructions for all hands, except the cook and steward, to get into her and go on shore with me. The men bustled about, nothing loath, for were they not going to get a change from the monotony of sea life, and at the same time provide themselves with the means of unlimited indulgence in more or less vicious enjoyment for the remainder of their lives? And I noticed with impotent anger that having at length arrived, as they supposed, at the goal of their villainous schemes, with the wealth which was to be the reward of their treachery all but within their grasp, as they believed, the restraint which they had hitherto so rigorously imposed upon themselves was in a measure laid aside, and they began to reveal themselves, both in speech and in action, as the unscrupulous scoundrels that they were. I paid no attention, however, to anything I saw or heard, leaving them to believe, if they pleased, that I regarded their behaviour as a simple ebullition of high spirits at the prospect of a little recreation ashore, and passing my sextant and other paraphernalia carefully down into the boat, quickly followed them, and gave the order to shove off. There were 12 of us all told in the boat. She was therefore pretty deep in the water, notwithstanding which, so eager were the men to get at the treasure that in less than 10 minutes from the time of leaving the ship we were once more in the creek, and pulling towards its head or northeastern corner, at which point I had noticed on the preceding evening that the timber appeared to be growing more thickly and heavily than elsewhere, and where, consequently, the task of penetrating it for any distance would involve the greatest labour and consume the most time. As we drew near the shore at this point, I observed, what had escaped my notice on the preceding evening, that a small stream of beautifully clear crystal water came brawling down through a steep, narrow ravine and discharged itself into the creek exactly at the spot for which we were heading, and I at once resolved to avail myself of its presence as a means of deluding the men into the belief that they were working at the right spot. Accordingly, when the boat grounded upon the beach, I ordered everybody out of her, with the picks and shovels, and set all hands to work, cutting pegs and long slender rods, under the direction of the boatswain, retaining Forbes and San Domingo, the negro, as assistants in my own especial part of the work. Within 10 minutes, the fellows had cut all the pegs and rods I could possibly require, and then, looking carefully and anxiously about me, I at length fixed a stout peg, with the nicest accuracy, in the sand at its junction with the grass, and exactly at the edge of the stream. Then I sent the men here and there with long wands, which I made them hold exactly perpendicular on the ground, adjusting their positions with the most finicking precision, until I had wrought them all firmly into the belief that the whole of this labour was gone through for the purpose of finding the exact spot where the treasure lay buried. Finally, I set out by compass, and indicated, by means of 2 long, slender rods stuck upright in the sand, a line that would take them straight into the bush, where it was thickest and most impenetrable, and told them to cut a straight line in that direction exactly 2,000 yards in length, from a peg which I had driven at the margin of the bush. This task I entrusted to Rogers and the 6 other men, who struck me as being the blackest sheep of the flock, while with Forbes, Joe Martin, Barr, McKinley, Christiansen and San Domingo, I took the boat with a sufficient supply of axes and shovels, and made the best of my way to the southern side of the small islet upon which the treasure was said to be hidden. Upon our arrival at the desired spot, my impression of the preceding evening, that it was entirely overgrown, was fully confirmed, it proving to be literally impossible to find a place where a landing could be effected without first clearing away the scrub. There was this difference, however, between the growth on the islet and that at the spot where I had left the boatswain and his party at work, that whereas the latter consisted almost exclusively of huge trees, the former was composed largely of scrub, with only a few trees here and there, so it would not be nearly so difficult to penetrate as the other. It was evident indeed to me, at a glance, now that I had the full light of day to aid me in my inspection, that the growth upon the islet was of much more recent date than that upon any part of the main island in sight from that spot, a fact which tended to confirm my previous suspicion that at the time of the burial of the treasure the soil of the islet had been bare, or nearly so, of arboreal growth. The growth, however, was there now, and it constituted a very formidable difficulty, for how was I to identify a point exactly 1,000 feet south of the obelisk rock, unless I could move freely over the ground for the purpose of obtaining my precise bearing and distance? Suddenly, a brilliant idea struck me. Immediately opposite the point on the islet at which I wished to land, there was a broad strip of sandy beach, constituting indeed part of the margin of the basin of which the island formed the centre. Would it be possible to make my measurements from that point? There could be no harm in trying, at all events, and we accordingly pulled across the water, landing at a part of the beach that looked eminently promising. The first thing was to determine the direction of a line running due south from the topmost pinnacle of the obelisk rock, and after a few trials with the compass I got this. My next act was to erect a line perpendicular to this along the sandy margin of the basin, which I accomplished with the aid of my sextant, taking care to make this second line as long as the nature of the ground would allow. Then, driving a peg into the sand at the intersection of these 2 lines, and another at the farther extremity of my second line, I had a right-angled triangle, whereof the 2 pegs and the obelisk rock marked the angles. I had now only to measure very carefully my second line, which I did by means of a surveyor's tape measure bought at Sydney for the purpose, and to take the angle between the perpendicular and the hypotenuse of my triangle, when I had the means of calculating all or any of the elements of the triangle that I desired. In this way, then, I ascertained that the pinnacle of the obelisk rock was exactly 6,477 feet due north of the peg I had driven into the sand to mark the intersection of my 2 lines. Then, returning to this same peg, I sent Forbes away to the islet in the boat with instructions to set up one of the oars with a white pocket handkerchief attached to it, on the shore of the islet at the precise spot I should indicate to him by signal. This spot I arranged to be exactly in line with the peg and the obelisk rock. All 3 points, therefore, were in one straight line, the bearing of which was due north and south, while its northern extremity was the obelisk rock. My next task was to take an angle to the oar from the peg at which I had taken the angle to the obelisk rock, which enabled me to determine that the oar was 3,802 feet from the intersecting peg, and consequently 2,675 feet from the obelisk rock. This completed all the data I required, for I had now only to drive a bold, conspicuous staff into the sand in place of my intersecting peg, and another into the ground on the islet where the oar now stood, and by cutting back into the scrub for a distance of 1,675 feet towards the obelisk rock, using these two staves as guides to keep their line straight, the workers would reach a spot exactly 1,000 feet south from the obelisk rock, or in other words, the hiding place of the treasure. The two guiding staves were soon fixed, and then, leaving Forbes to superintend the operations of Joe, Barr, and McKinley, I replaced my instruments in the boat, and with Christiansen and San Domingo at the oars, paddled on board the Barque for the purpose of bringing Sir Edgar and the whole of his party on shore, in order that they might indulge in a run on the beautiful sandy strand of the basin, and enjoy a nearer view of the entrancing loveliness of this exquisite gem of the Pacific. End of Chapter 15. Recorded by Dave Wills.
Chapter 16 of The Cruise of the Esmeralda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marty on the Central Coast of California. The Cruise of the Esmeralda by Harry Collingwood. The Finding of the Treasure and What Followed. Knowing that there was work enough to occupy the party on the islet for probably the next 2 days, I did not consider it necessary to keep watch upon their labors, but left them with Forbes in charge, and joined the Desmond party in a ramble over the island. This, by following the ravines, the bottoms of which were comparatively free from undergrowth, we found less difficult of accomplishment than we had anticipated, and although the toil of clambering up the steep acclivities and over the smooth boulders that in many places encumbered the way proved rather trying to our unaccustomed limbs, we nevertheless managed to make our way to the summit of the Nose, as we called it, from whence we obtained a superb panoramic view of the entire island. That the place was uninhabited we could now no longer doubt, for although from our lofty standpoint we had the whole surface of the island spread out like a map beneath us, there was nowhere any break whatever in the dense vegetation which flourished so luxuriantly on the rich soil, nothing whatever to indicate the existence of cleared and cultivated patches, as there certainly would have been had the island been inhabited. Nor did we observe any sign or trace whatever of animals of any sort. Birds seemed to be the only living creatures inhabiting this lovely spot, and they appeared to swarm in thousands wherever we happened to come upon a comparatively open space. Fruits of several kinds abounded on the island, among the most abundant being bananas, mangoes, breadfruit, and coconuts. We were also fortunate enough to come upon several granadilla vines, the product of which was just ripe, and we accordingly loaded ourselves with as many of these delicious fruits as we could carry. Our return journey was effected by a somewhat shorter route than which we had followed on our outward way, and eventually we hit upon a ravine down which brawled a small stream of deliciously sweet, crystal-clear water, following which we came out upon the margin of the basin at the point where Rogers and his party were working. Despite the intense heat and a perfect plague of mosquitoes, the fellows were toiling as if for life, and had already succeeded in clearing a line of fully 100 feet in length. I critically examined their work, pronounced it all right, and we then went on to the islet, Sir Edgar and I discussing, by the way, the distracting question of how the crew were to be dealt with in the event of our finding the treasure. The question seemed to resolve itself into this: that the men must either be taken away in the ship, or left on the island, and if the former, they would certainly have to be taken as prisoners, since if free they would assuredly seize the ship, even if they had to murder me in order to accomplish their purpose. As prisoners, however, they would be worse than useless. They would be a continual menace and source of anxiety. Sir Edgar consequently agreed with me that I should be fully justified in leaving them, or at all events the worst of them, behind. And this I at length determined to do, watching my opportunity to divide them up into small parties, upon some pretext, and making prisoners of them in detail, thus minimizing the risk of a fight, and its too probable accompaniment, loss of life. There would be no likelihood whatever of the rascals starving in such a land of plenty as the island had proved to be. They could not possibly suffer any very serious discomfort in so genial a climate, and the treasure once secured, it would be no difficult matter to arrange for their speedy rescue. This matter settled, I felt somewhat easier in my mind, and now only required an opportunity to discuss and arrange the details with Forbes and Joe. On reaching the islet, we found that here, too, wonderful progress had been made, the party under Forbes having already cleared a line through the scrub of very nearly 400 feet in length. This was due to the fact that they had hitherto encountered no trees in the actual line of their work, though several had been very narrowly missed. It was apparent, however, that on the morrow they would be less fortunate, for which I was by no means sorry, as it would lengthen the duration of the work, and afford me a better opportunity for completing my plans. That same evening after dinner, Forbes, Sir Edgar, and I discussed the matter in detail, and finally completed certain arrangements that appeared to us to promise a fairly satisfactory solution of the whole difficulty. On the following day I found an opportunity to communicate to Joe the pith of these arrangements, which were to be put into operation as soon as ever the treasure, if found, should be safely placed on board the barque, and he cheerfully undertook to maintain a constant watch for my signals, and to be ready for action whenever I should make them. The next 3 days passed uneventfully away, the men working perhaps not quite so hard as they had at the outset, but still making fairly good progress. The party on the islet had reached to within 80 feet of their goal when they knocked off that night. And now, for the first time, I think, I began to fully realize the momentous character of the issues that were probably to be decided within the next 24 hours. Would the treasure be found? Hitherto it had never occurred to me to seriously reflect that there might possibly be an unfavorable reply to this question. But now that only a few short hours lay between me and certainty, I suddenly began to comprehend how much depended upon whether that reply should prove to be a yea or nay, and an almost uncontrollable impatience to have the matter definitely decided took possession of me, rendering sleep that night an impossibility. But even with the impatient, though time may lag upon leaden wings, he passes at last, and the morning at length dawned upon me with my nerves quieted and steadied by exhaustion and the reaction from the night's intolerable excitement. As it was confidently expected that, if the treasure really existed, and still reposed in its alleged hiding place, it would that day be found, the ladies determined to go on shore to witness its disinterment, taking the nursemaids and children with them in order that the latter might enjoy what would probably prove to be their last opportunity for a ramble on the lovely island. Accordingly, the party being a large one, both gigs were manned, and all hands of us, even to the cook and steward, went ashore, leaving the ship to take care of herself, the wind being a gentle breeze from the eastward, or somewhat off the land, with a fine settled look about the weather. Rogers and his party resumed their usual work at the head of the basin, and Forbes with his gang vigorously attacked the narrow belt of scrub that still interposed between them and their goal. It happened, however, that this bit of scrub, was more thickly dotted with trees than any other portion that they had yet met with, so that it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon before a very careful final measurement assured us that the most laborious part of our task had come to an end. The ground, however, was still covered with debris, which had to be cleared away before the actual digging operations could be commenced, and this occupied fully another hour. By this time the evening shadows had begun to climb up the hillsides. Nevertheless, the men seized their picks and shovels, and with renewed energy began to turn up the ground. They toiled thus for an hour, by which time they had excavated a hole some 3 feet deep in the center, and I had actually, with great reluctance, given the word to knock off, when Barque, driving his pick deep into the ground where he intended to leave it that night, struck upon something harder than soil. "Hurrah, boys!" he exclaimed. "Here's something at last. Stick to it, and let's see what it is before we leave it." At it again they accordingly went, with such desperate vigor that the perspiration literally poured off their arms and down their necks, and in a few minutes they succeeded in laying bare the top of a solid timber chest, strongly bound with iron. They were very anxious to get this chest out of the ground there and then, but on attempting to clear the earth away from round about it, it was found that the chest was only one of several others all packed closely together, so that it would be necessary to reach one of the outer chests before any of them could be conveniently moved. We were consequently compelled to content ourselves that night with the knowledge that we had found something, and to wait until the next morning to ascertain the value of our discovery. The following sunrise found us once more en route for the shore, this time provided with a couple of spare studding sail booms to act as shears for the more convenient hoisting out of the chests, together with such rope, blocks, etc., as we should require for the purpose. The size of the chests, however, was such as would probably tax the strength of the entire party to handle them, and I was therefore reluctantly compelled to call in the assistance of Rogers and his party. Even thus reinforced, it soon became apparent that a heavy task lay before us, and it was not until the boatswain was piping to breakfast that the first chest was successfully broken out and raised to the surface. Breakfast was soon over that morning, and then the question arose, how were such ponderous chests to be conveyed to the ship? They measured roughly about 2½ feet square, and were so heavy that 8 men, all who could conveniently get round one of them, could not raise the weight from the ground, much less carry it along a narrow path cumbered with stumps and prostrate trunks of trees. Greatly as I disliked such a proceeding, it seemed that there was no alternative but to break open each chest and convey its contents piecemeal to the boats, and this course was therefore perforce adopted. The task of merely breaking open the chest proved to be one of no ordinary difficulty, for they were constructed of solid oak, nearly 3 inches thick, so well made and so strongly bound with iron that I could not help surmising that they must have been the chests in which the Spaniards had originally stowed the treasure, and specially made for the purpose. They were black with age, but the timber was perfectly sound, while the iron bands, though more than half eaten away with rust, were still stout enough to give us an immense amount of trouble. At length, however, the first chest was broken open, and was found to contain 64 bricks or ingots of solid silver. They were arranged in 4 tiers of 16 bricks each, exactly fitting the chest, and each brick weighed about 1/4 of a hundredweight. Each chest, therefore, if all contained the same precious metal, would represent the value of 16 hundredweight of silver. How many chests there were we did not yet know, but it was evident that there were several. Some said there were 8 or 9, but I thought there must be more, judging by the way in which they were arranged in the ground. The men were now divided into 2 working parties, one of which, under my supervision, carried the silver to one of the boats, while the other, under Forbes, proceeded to break out and open another chest. The contents of one chest I considered a sufficient load for the gig, and accordingly, as soon as this amount had been placed in her, we shoved off for the ship. My crew consisting of Joe, the Norwegian, the Negro, and an American named Barque. On arriving alongside, the silver was simply passed up the side and pitched down the after hatchway upon the ballast for the present. The ladies, who had elected to remain on board this day on account of the heat, were so filled with excitement and delight at the sight of the silver and the news of our find, that they could no longer remain quietly where they were. They must needs go ashore once more and see all this wealth brought out of the ground, and accordingly, upon our return passage, they went with us, taking the maids and the children with them. On our arrival at the islet, we found the second gig awaiting us, with her cargo in her, which the other party had just finished loading, so we left the one boat and took the other, treating this cargo as we had the last, and so the work went merrily on until the men's dinner time, by which time we had raised and transported 8 boxes of silver, and it had by this time been ascertained that there were 8 more still to be dealt with. A hurried meal was snatched, and the work was resumed, 3 more of the chests being disposed of by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then another surprise met us. The next chest contained gold instead of silver, the ingots being only 9 in number, somewhat larger than the silver ingots, and weighing, as nearly as we could estimate, about 100 weight each. Each of these gold ingots was neatly wrapped and sewn into a covering of hide. On our return from the ship, after conveying this precious cargo on board, we were met with the news that 2 other chests, since opened, also contained gold. And not to detain the reader necessarily, it eventually proved that the remaining cases, 2 in number, likewise contained the same precious metal. The total find thus consisted of 11 chests containing 704 ingots of silver and 5 chests containing 135 ingots of gold. All through the long, hot afternoon the work went on with unremitting energy, for it soon became apparent that darkness would be upon us before the last of the treasure could be moved. I was just completing the transfer of the 3rd chest of gold to the ship when the sun sank in a perfect blaze of splendor below the horizon, and a few of the brighter stars were already twinkling in the zenith when we ranged up alongside the other boat at the landing place upon the islet. As I stepped out of the light boat into the loaded one, and directed my crew to follow, one of the men, an Irishman named O'Connor, touched his forehead in the approved shellback style and observed,
"Av ye please, sir, Mr. Forbes was saying, would ye be so kind as to step along the hole afore ye makes your next trip to the ship? He's after wanting to speak to ye."
"Oh, very good," said I, and stepping ashore I directed Joe to go across to the other side of the basin to fetch the ladies and children who had crossed earlier in the afternoon, and now stood waiting to be conveyed back to the ship, and then went groping my way along the dark, uneven path toward the hole. The man O'Connor and somebody else, who it was I could not distinguish in the gloom, were stumbling along in front of me, and making very poor headway, I thought, for I quickly overtook them. They were in my way, working along as they were, 2 abreast, for the path was very narrow, so I said to them, "Here, let me pass, you 2, I am in a hurry." They stepped aside without a word, one to one side of the pathway and one to the other, and as I passed between them, one of them cried, "Now!" and before I could even so much as think, they both flung themselves upon me and bore me to the ground, one of them springing upon me from behind, with his arms round my neck and his knee into the small of my back, while the other dashed himself upon his knees on my chest, and gripped me by the throat by one hand, as he pressed the cold muzzle of a revolver to my temple with the other.
"A single word or a movement, and I'll pull the trigger on ye as sure as death,"
ejaculated O'Connor between his set teeth as he tightened his grip upon my throat.
"Now, Bill, fill of his pockets and take his barkers away, if he has any, while I hold him. Now, listen to what I'm a-telling ye. The others, that's Mr. Forbes and the gentleman, is already took, so you needn't be expecting any help from them. And as we've got such a heap of gold and silver out of this hole, we're going to be content with it, and intend to take the trifling liberty of burying the ship to carry it away with us. You can have the rest yourselves, and much good may it do ye. Ah, that's right, Bill," as the latter extracted a brace of loaded revolvers from my jacket pocket. "Just feel, while ye are about it, if he has a knife, and take that from him too. Now are ye sure that's all?"
As the other man, who now proved to be Rogers, took my knife away also.
"Very well. Now, Captain dear, you may get upon your feet, but understand me, if ye attempts to lay hands upon either of us, the other will shoot ye through the head without waiting to say, 'By your leave.' Ards now, it's kilt he is, I do believe."
As the fellow rose from my prostrate body and saw that I made no movement, for all this time he had kept so tight a hold upon my throat that he fairly strangled me, and though I still, in a dreamy way, heard him speaking, my strength had entirely left me, and I was scarcely conscious of my surroundings.
"I'll fire a shot to let the others know that it's all right, and then we'll have to carry 'em as far as the boats,"
remarked Rogers.
"Perhaps a dip in the water may bring 'em round."
Such extreme measures, however, proved unnecessary, for my throat once released, my senses began to come back to me, and by the time that we had reached the shore of the islet, I was once more able to stand. Arrived here, I was compelled to enter the empty gig, and was carried across to the opposite shore of the creek, where the ladies still remained, my order to bring them across having been countermanded in a whisper by one of the men the moment that I had turned my back. On reaching the other side, I was ordered out of the boat, a loaded revolver being exhibited as a hint to me to hasten my movements, but as I stumbled forward over the thwarts, Joe offered me the support of his arm, murmuring in my ear as I stepped out on the sand.
"Cheer up, Captain. This here's a most unexpected move, and no mistake, but the ship ain't gone yet, and from what I heard passing among the others just now, afore you come up, I ain't by no means sure as they'll leave tonight. Some of 'em is that greedy, and they wants to stop and have a shy at the other treasure, and if they does, there's no knowing what may happen betwixt now and then, and if they makes up their minds to go, I don't go with 'em. I'll slip overboard and swim ashore if there's no other way of joining you."
I only had time to murmur a word of thanks for this expression of sympathy when he left me and returned to the boat, which immediately shoved off for the islet. The ladies, who with the nursemaids and the children still stood waiting to be conveyed to the ship, saw by the actions of the men that there was something amiss, and now approached me, inquiring anxiously what was the matter. Of course I had no alternative but to explain to them that the men had risen in mutiny, and had seized the ship, and although I made as light of it as I could, it was a sorry tale at best that I had to tell them. I was still in the midst of my story when the phosphorescent flash of oars became visible in the black shadow of the islet, and presently the outline of the boat, telling dark upon the starlit surface of the still water, was seen approaching. As she drew near, the voice of Rogers came pealing across the water.
"Shore ahoy! Just walk a bit farther back from the water's edge. There, or we shall be obliged to fire. We're about to land Sir Edgar, and if there's any sign of a rush at the boat, we shall shoot to kill. So if you don't want to be hurt, you'd better stand well back."
"Hold on there a moment," I answered back, disregarding the threat. "Surely, men, you do not intend to abandon us here unarmed, without a shelter from the weather, and with only the clothes we stand up in?"
"Oh, you'll do well enough, I don't doubt," replied Rogers brutally. "You don't want arms, because there's nobody nor nothing here that'll hurt you. You don't need clothes, because the climate's so warm that you can do without 'em. And as to shelter, why, we've left all the axes and shovels ashore. You're welcome to them, and if you can't build a house with such tools as that, you deserves to go without. There's plenty of fruit and plenty of good water, so you won't starve. And lastly, there's a chance for you to get all the treasure that's in the other hole, if we decides we don't want it ourselves."
"What?" I exclaimed indignantly. after stealing my ship and my treasure from me, you will not go to the small trouble of passing the ladies' and children's clothing into a boat and sending it?"
"Well, if you won't stand back, take that!"
interrupted Rogers, and as the word left his lips there was a flash, a sharp report, and a bullet went singing close past my ear. At the same moment I felt my arm seized by a white figure that unexpectedly appeared at my side, and Miss Merrivale's voice, rendered almost inarticulate by scorn and anger, exclaimed,
"Leave the cowardly brutes alone. You shall not humiliate yourself further by stooping to ask a favor from them, even on our behalf. Nor shall you wantonly expose yourself to the risk of being murdered in cold blood. I will not have it."
With which she dragged me unresistingly to the spot where her sister and the children stood, and then, without a word of warning, flung herself prone upon the sand and burst into a perfect passion of tears. "Nay, do not give way thus, I pray you," I said as I knelt beside her and raised her prostrate form in my arms. "Our plight is bad enough, I grant you, though not so bad that it might not easily be very much worse. And if you will only try to be brave and patient, we will soon arrange matters so that you shall not be altogether destitute of comfort and—"
"Do you think I care for my own comfort?"
she interrupted me passionately.
"No. As that wretch said, we are not likely to starve, and I suppose you and Edgar will be able to build such a shelter as will suffice to protect us from the sun and rain. It is not that. It is, oh, the base, ungrateful, contemptible creatures to treat you like this. I am sure they will be punished for it."
"Ay, that they will," exclaimed Sir Edgar cheerily as he joined the group. "Well, Emmy darling, and you chicks, will it be very dreadful hardship for you all to sleep on this beautiful soft white sand to-night? To-morrow we shall have light enough to work by, and I have no doubt that before the end of the day St. Leger and I will have contrived to stick up a hut or something to cover you. Why, children, this is a regular, genuine picnic, in which we shall have everything to do for ourselves, and you will be able to help, too. It will be glorious fun for you, will it not?" And so on. Never in all my life before had I seen a man take a heavy, bitter blow so bravely as this gallant gentleman did. He knew, for he had already had time to fully realize it, all that so cruel an abandonment meant to him and his. Yet his courage never faltered for a moment. Not the faintest glimpse did he allow to appear of the anguish that must have at that moment been ringing in his heart. No, his voice, his manner, and his whole bearing were inflexibly dominated by the determination to cheer and encourage the dear ones who were now absolutely dependent upon him, and him alone, for support and encouragement to meet and face this sudden, dreadful reverse of fortune. As I looked at and listened to him in astonishment and admiration, I felt ashamed at my own despondency, at the condition, temporary only though I believed it to be, of complete helplessness to which the blow had reduced me. And in contemplating such indomitable courage, I not only learned a lesson that I trust has benefited and toned my whole life since then, but I also gathered fresh courage and resolution to face the responsibilities and demands of the immediate present. End of chapter 16. Read by Marty on the Central Coast of California.
Chapter 17 of The Cruise of the Esmeralda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Wills. The Cruise of the Esmeralda by Arie COLLINGWOOD. Chapter 17. The Recapture of the Barque. Under the soothing influence of her brother-in-law's admirable manner, Miss Merrivale soon recovered her wonted serenity of manner, while Lady Emily seemed never to have lost hers. So absolute was her trust and confidence in her husband and his power to strengthen and reassure her. In less than half an hour, therefore, after the departure of the boat, we were all sitting in a circle upon the sandy beach of the basin, regaling ourselves upon some of the fruit that the ladies had gathered earlier in the day, and discussing meanwhile the possibilities of our situation. Notwithstanding the brutally callous behaviour of Rogers, I still hoped, and Sir Edgar fully believed, that a majority of the men on board would be sufficiently swayed by motives of humanity to insist upon bringing us ashore our clothing, and at least a few of the more obvious necessities of life, such as a spare sail, a coil or two of line, a few nails, a hammer, a saw, a trifle of crockery, some cooking utensils, and above all our fowling pieces and some ammunition. Miss Merivale, however, was positive that they would not, and as the time dragged slowly by without any sign of the reappearance of the boat, I began at last to fear that she would prove to be right. A brightening in the sky to the eastward, over the crest of the lofty heights that towered above us in that direction, at length announced the rising of the moon, and at the same time made us aware that some 4 hours had elapsed since sunset. As the mild radiance of the silver luminary met my gaze, I started to my feet and said, "There is the moon rising, and we shall soon have light enough to make our final dispositions for the night. Meanwhile, as you are all perfectly safe here, I will endeavour to make my way round to the beach abreast of the ship and see what they are about on board. If they intend to go to sea tonight, they will soon be making a move to get under way, and if they do not, there may yet be a chance for us to do something, with Martin's assistance."
"What?" exclaimed Sir Edgar. "Do you still believe in that fellow's fidelity?"
"Yes," said I stoutly. "Do not you?"
"Well," answered Sir Edgar, "I did, most implicitly. But since the shameful business of this evening, I must confess that I have begun to entertain doubts of him. All your plans and precautions, you see, have been framed upon the information with which he has supplied you. And if he really were in the men's confidence and anxious to serve you, how came it that he was not aware of the coup which the men have so successfully executed? Or, if aware of their intentions, why did he not make an opportunity to warn us? I confess that to me it appears very much as though the men had all along feared some suspicion on your part, and had employed him to throw you off your guard."
"No," said I meditatively. "No, I cannot think that. There are certainly 1 or 2 circumstances connected with his behaviour that I cannot at present fully understand, and perhaps we shall now never know whether he was really faithful or not. But I still believe him to be so, and I feel confident that, if he cannot help us in any other way, he and Forbes, between them, will devise some means for procuring our speedy rescue. Now, I'm off of the beach. You, I suppose, will remain here. You can scarcely do better tonight, and it is desirable that I should know exactly where to find you again without difficulty, should any unforeseen contingency arise." While I was speaking, Miss Merivale had risen to her feet impetuously, with all the eager, determined look in her face of one who was about to say or do something of a very decisive character. But if such was her intention, she checked herself, seemingly at the moment when the words were about to escape her lips, and contented herself by saying instead, "Pray be very careful what you do, Captain. Remember that we are all now utterly dependent upon you." I assured her that she might depend absolutely upon my discretion, smiling, rather bitterly meanwhile, at the reflection that, throughout this business at least, my discretion had been by no means brilliantly conspicuous. And so, with a bow, left the little party clustered together upon the white sand. A curious yet pretty picture to anyone who could have been suddenly transported from the surroundings of civilization to that lonely island of the Pacific. Making my way rapidly along the margin of the basin, close to the water's edge where the sand was firm and walking consequently easy, I soon reached the projecting point that marked the junction of the creek with the river, and bent my steps along the narrow beach towards the estuary. For some distance in this direction, the only sound to break the silence of the night was the loud, continuous, indescribable whir of the countless myriads of insects that haunted the recesses of the jungle. But at length, on rounding a bend in the river, I caught sight of the Barque, still at anchor, and at the same moment became conscious of a new sound that, as I progressed towards the mouth of the river, gradually resolved itself into the tones of human voices uplifted in an attempt at melody. The thought that struck me as this sound first met my ear was that the men had decided to go to sea forthwith, and were now heaving short the cable, an impression that at once determined me to push on and watch the departure of the sweet little craft. But as I worked my way cautiously along towards the open beach, keeping well within the shadow of the trees in order that my movements might not attract attention, for the moon, somewhat past the full, now rode high enough in the cloudless sky to render the most minute objects distinctly visible, I bethought me that the mutineers could not be getting their anchor, or I should by this time hear the sharp clank of the windlass pawls mingling with their song. Moreover, I was now near enough to distinguish that the singing was not the wailing, monotonous chant and rousing chorus of a shanty, but a confused medley of sound, as though all the hands were singing at once, and every man a different tune. And I at once came to the conclusion that the fellows had secured some liquor, and were indulging in a carouse. Should this be indeed the case, and I fervently hoped that it was, they would probably not desist until every man had become helplessly intoxicated, as they had doubtless secured Forbes so effectively that there would be no possibility of his recovering his freedom until someone chose to release him, while they would scarcely deign to give a thought to us on shore, with the knowledge that the ship was distant at least half a mile from the nearest point of the beach, and that both gigs were securely swinging at the davits. As this conviction dawned upon me, a feeling of renewed hope and fierce exultation leapt up in my heart, and my brain at once became busy with plans for the recovery of the ship. For one of my few accomplishments was that I was a fast and tireless swimmer, and provided that there were no sharks in the neighborhood, the half-mile of water that intervened between me and the Esmeralda was no more formidable an obstacle than had it consisted of firm, level roadway. Judging, however, by the present vigorous character of the singing that came pealing across to me from the ship, the opportune moment for such an attempt as I meditated was yet a good hour distant, and I therefore determined to stroll leisurely back to the party at the creek, and acquaint them with the new phase of affairs. When at length I rejoined the group, I found that during my absence Sir Edgar had so far completed his arrangements for the night that the maids and the children were comfortably bestowed upon the warm, yielding sand, fast asleep, with their heads and faces well shielded from the rays of the moon by a small tent-like structure, consisting of a shawl stretched over an arrangement of sticks cunningly bound together with tough, pliant monkey rope, while Lady Emily slumbered peacefully by her husband's side, with his arm about her waist, while her head rested upon his shoulder. Miss Merivale, however, and Sir Edgar were still awake, and as I approached them, the former started to her feet, and with her finger upon her lips, as she pointed to the little group of sleepers, murmured softly, "How long you have been! And what an eager, glad look there is in your face! What has happened? I'm sure you have good news to tell us." "Good thus far," I admitted, "that the ship has not yet gone to sea, and I believe that she will not now go until tomorrow. The men appear to have obtained possession of some liquor, and are indulging in a royal carouse, if one may judge by the singing and noise that I heard going on aboard when I was down at the beach, and I'm not without the hope that ere the night be much older, the fellows will have drunk themselves into a helpless state of intoxication. Now, if upon my return presently to my late post of observation I should have reason to believe that such a thing has happened, I shall swim quietly off to the ship and endeavour to get on board her without disturbing anybody, and should I be able to manage this, my next task will be to discover and liberate the mate. This once accomplished, it shall go hard with us if we do not succeed in retaking the ship from the drunken rascals
and repaying them in their own coin. "By Jove, St. Ledger, you are grit all through, as the Yankees say. It is a bold scheme, and I believe you will succeed," exclaimed Sir Edgar admiringly. "I would that I could accompany you," he added wistfully, "for in such an undertaking every additional man on your side is of incalculable value. But unfortunately my swimming powers are not equal to anything like such a stretch of water as that between the shore and the ship, and I should only be an embarrassment instead of a help to you, unless, indeed, I could contrive to do the distance with the aid of a log to float me."
"No," said I. "I am infinitely grateful to you, Sir Edgar, for your readiness to assist in this undertaking, but it is not to be thought of. Your place is manifestly here, by the side of your family, so that, should events turn out awkwardly, they may not be left on the island without a defender. We will not, however, contemplate any such unfortunate endings as that to the adventure. On the contrary, let us rather look forward hopefully to the prospect of your all breakfasting on board as usual tomorrow morning. You understand, of course, that should I succeed, my first act after securing the mutineers will be to come ashore in a boat for you."
"Do you suppose we do not know that?" exclaimed Miss Merrivale impetuously. "But it is a desperately dangerous enterprise, and, oh, why is it that women are such shamefully useless creatures in crises like these? If our strength were only equal to our courage—"
"You could not even then be more absolutely irresistible than you are now," I interrupted, with a low bow and a poor attempt at gallantry. "Your turn will come, however, be assured of that," I continued, "for whichever way this project of mine turns, you will have ample opportunity for the display of both courage and helpfulness. Should we ever succeed in recapturing the ship, it is more than probable that I shall sometimes be compelled to call upon you all to afford help in such matters as the steering of her and so on. But it is full early yet to talk like this."
"So far as I am concerned, your call shall not be in vain," exclaimed the spirited girl, with a flash of her eyes that thrilled through me like an electric shock. "If I have not the physical strength of a man, I have at least as resolute a will, which is no mean substitute for it. And now, good-bye, for I see that you are longing to get away. You will be careful, though, will you not, and not run any unnecessary risks?"
I took the hand that was so frankly extended to me, and gave it a hearty squeeze, gazed for an instant into the eyes that dwelt so anxiously upon mine, and, immeasurably cheered and encouraged by the interest and sympathy that I read there, turned away quickly and stepped briskly out towards the mouth of the creek once more. The time I had taken to walk to and from the basin appeared to have sufficed the carousers to drink themselves well on towards a condition of oblivion, for when I again reached the beach opposite the ship, the singing had subsided into an occasional maudling howl that, in its turn, soon afterwards yielded to the stupefying effects of the liquor, and a dead silence fell upon the ship. I did not wait, however, for this final stage of insensibility to arrive amongst the mutineers, but kicked off my shoes, and laying them with my hat and jacket upon the sand, immediately upon my arrival at my former post of observation, at once entered the water and started to swim with long, steady, deliberate strokes towards the ship. The water was perfectly calm and smooth, as well as deliciously warm, so that, despite the leisurely character of my exertions, I made excellent progress, and in a shorter time than I had thought possible, found myself within the deep shadow of the ship's hull. Everything was by this time as silent as death on board, save for the slight jerk of the wheel chains and the sob of the water along the bends and about the rudder, as the ship swung gently upon the long, low-ground swell, the edge of which just caught her as it crept up from the westward across the mouth of the small estuary where she lay at anchor. So still and silent was the breathless night that the volume of sound raised by the insects on shore rang in my ears almost as distinctly out here as it had done when I stood upon the beach. It was, however, so far mellowed and softened by the intervening distance that it was possible to hear other sounds distinctly through it, even when they were so faint as the slight, almost imperceptible creak of the yard parrels aloft, and the light flap of a coiled-up rope striking against the bulwarks, with the slight, easy roll of the ship. I was therefore particularly careful not to make the faintest splash as I drew up alongside, lest the unaccustomed sound should reach the ear of and startle some individual not yet completely overpowered by the drink he had swallowed. Fortunately for me, the gangway ladder had not been hauled up, and I was consequently free to board the ship well aft, thus greatly lessening the risk of detection. I had therefore only to wait until the roll of the ship brought the ladder within my grasp, seize it, and draw myself noiselessly out of the water. This was precisely the course that I followed, and I had already drawn myself up clear of the water when there occurred a rush and swirl immediately beneath me, and I received so smart a blow that I narrowly escaped being knocked off the ladder, as a large shark sprang half his length out of the water after me and fell back with a terrific splash, loud enough, I am sure, to have been distinctly heard on shore, had there been anyone on the beach to hear it. The brute had evidently been lurking under the ship's bottom, attracted there, doubtless, by the refuse thrown overboard from time to time by the cook, and had only become aware of my presence just in time to make a rapid, ill-directed rush that had very narrowly missed me. Oh, how fervently I thanked heaven as I sprang up the side, beyond the reach of a possible second rush, that the necessity for a cautious approach to the ship had rendered my movements so noiseless that the great fish had not discovered me until too late. That the sudden and violent disturbance alongside had, however, not passed unnoticed on deck was immediately apparent by the appearance of a human head over the rail by the fore-rigging, only to disappear instantly, however, and make its reappearance at the gangway. As it did so, a voice that I instantly recognized as Joe's murmured in low, cautious tones, "Is that you, Captain?" "Yes, Joe," I replied with equal caution, as I paused with my eyes on a level with the rail. "How is it on board? Have the rascals drunk themselves stupid?" "Aye, that's just exactly what they have done," answered Joe. "And I was just creeping quietly aft to cast Mr. Forbes loose, by the way of a start, when I heard the row alongside. How did it happen, sir? Did you slip and fall backwards?" "No," I returned. "It was a shark that rose at me from under the ship's bottom, and a narrow escape I have had of it. The brute struck me with his snout as he sprang out of the water, and all but knocked me off the ladder." "A shark!" exclaimed Joe in dismay. "My word, sir, you have had a narrow squeak, and no mistake. You stop where you are now, sir, out of sight for a minute, while I goes for'ard and just sees whether the rumpus has roused any of 'em. I'll be back in a brace of shakes." So saying, Joe sauntered carelessly away forward again, loitered aimlessly about the foredeck for a few moments, and sauntered quietly aft again, past the larboard gangway, and so round abaft the mainmast and capstan until he rejoined me again. "All right, sir," he whispered. "They ain't all asleep, but every mother's son of 'em is that helplessly drunk we can do anything we likes with 'em. Now, sir," as I stepped in on the deck, "if you likes to go to your cabin and shift into dry clothes, I'll go and cut poor Mr. Forbes adrift. I'm afraid he ain't none too comfortable, for it seems to me as the beggars was passing the seasons pretty taut when they lashed him up tonight." "Is that so?" said I indignantly. "Then we will go and cut him adrift before doing anything else, Joe. He may be enduring cruel torments all this time. Where is he?" "Locked in his own berth, sir," answered Joe. "And that reminds me, I don't know who's got a key." "They may have left it in the door," I hazarded. "Who locked him in?" "Rogers and Moore, sir. They are the two ringleaders in this here business." We had by this time reached the mate's cabin, but found the door locked and the key missing. As I tried the door handle, I thought I heard a groan from the interior. So, without wasting time to search about for the key, I set my back against the bulkhead of the passage and my foot against the door by the lock, and the next moment we had the door open. A shapeless object upon the floor of the cabin, indistinctly seen in the semi-darkness which pervaded the place, proved to be the mate, lying just as he had been carelessly flung in there hours before, with his wrists and heels lashed together behind his back. The poor fellow was in a dreadful state, having laid there all those hours in excruciating agony from the cruel pressure of the lashings about his limbs, which with brutal carelessness had been drawn so tight as to have completely stopped the circulation of the blood in his extremities. His limbs were now swollen almost out of recognition. He had bitten his lower lip right through in the extremity of his torment. His beard was drenched with bloody foam, and our efforts to release him occasioned him such exquisite agony that he fainted under our hands. A sharp knife, however, speedily freed him from his bonds, after which Joe and I gently chafed his swollen wrists and ankles until the circulation of the blood was restored. But it was nearly an hour before the poor fellow was able to move with any degree of freedom. At length, however, he pronounced himself ready for action. When going on deck and arming ourselves with a heavy brass belaying pin each, the three of us proceeded forward, resolutely determined to stand no nonsense whatsoever from anybody who should presume to interfere with us. It was, therefore, a distinctly unfortunate circumstance for Rogers that he should, a moment or two previously, have awakened from his drunken sleep and staggered to his feet, with apparently some confused notion of taking a look round the ship and assuring himself that all was all right. For, coming face to face with Forbes and Joe as they rounded the corner of the galley, he was promptly felled by the latter with a blow from a belaying pin that must have caused him discomfort for many a day afterwards, while its immediate effect was to stretch him out upon the deck, senseless and bleeding. The sound of his fall disturbed one or two of the rest, all of whom were sprawled out inertly upon the foredeck, in the midst of empty and overturned bottles and pannikins, just sufficiently to cause them to raise their heads and grumble out a few unintelligible words. But we had no difficulty whatever with them, and in less than half an hour we had the whole lot of them securely bound hand and foot, lying at our mercy. Having reduced them to this condition and disarmed them, we distributed them about the deck fore and aft, lashing each man separately to a ring-bolt, cleat, or other convenient mooring, in such a way that no man might be within another's reach. For I had heard before now of men releasing each other by working at the lashings with their teeth, and then left them to recover their sober senses at their leisure, while we busied ourselves about other matters. Our first act was to lower the port quarter-boat, get into her, and pull ashore to the creek, where we found Sir Edgar and his party pretty much as I had left them, he and Miss Merivale being the only two still awake. Our arrival was greeted with a shout of delight from the baronet that effectually woke the sleepers, and the whole party quickly tumbled into the boat, Sir Edgar and Lady Emily vying with each other in the heartiness of their congratulations at our success and the eagerness with which they asked for the details of the adventure. Miss Merivale, on the contrary, was strangely silent, contenting herself with a warm clasp of the hand at the moment of our reunion. And presently, when we had shoved off again for the ship, I noticed that she was furtively crying. I concluded that the reaction from the long hours of suspense that she had just passed through had proved rather too much for her nerves, and so prudently appeared to take no notice whatever of her little breakdown. We soon reached the ship, and upon my solemn assurance that they might do so with absolute safety, the rescued party at once retired below to their respective cabins, Miss Merivale only lingering behind for a moment to say, "I have no words to express how glad and thankful I am that you have been successful in your hazardous enterprise. You are a brave man, as well as— but," with a sudden merry smile, "I will not say more, lest I make you vain. Good night." I was beginning to feel a bit puzzled at this young lady's manner, which seemed to have undergone a subtle, indescribable change within the last 12 hours. That was as incomprehensible as it was pleasant. It was just then, however, scarcely a suitable moment for speculation upon such an inscrutable subject as the deportment of a lovely and charming woman to a simple sailor like myself. So I dismissed the matter from my mind and turned to the consideration of other subjects, less agreeable but calling more imperatively for my immediate attention. The first thing was to summon Forbes and Joe to a council of war for discussion of the question what was to be done with the mutineers. There were some of them that it would be obviously impossible to retain on board the ship with the least chance of safety to ourselves, but I scarcely believed that they could all be equally bad, and I was in hopes that upon consultation with Joe I should learn that we might trust a sufficient number of them to enable us to make the voyage to Valparaiso in safety, where I thought it probable I might be able to pick up an entire new crew without very much difficulty. On submitting the question to him, however, Joe gave it as his very decided opinion that there were only 3 out of the 11 mutineers whom it would be in the least degree prudent to trust. Those 3 being the Negro, the Swede, and Barque, one of the Americans. These 3 we accordingly gave the benefit of the doubt for the moment, and that point settled, we next proceeded to draw up a list of such articles as we deemed absolutely necessary to the welfare of the men whose conduct had rendered it imperative that we should maroon them. After some consideration, the contents of this list resolved themselves into each man's personal effects in their entirety, including weapons and ammunition, the latter, however, to be securely screwed up in a stout wooden case so that it might not be got at and used against us while effecting the transfer of the mutineers to the shore, a saw, hammer, chisel, and an assortment of nails, 6 barrels of beef, and the same of bread, a 1/2 chest of tea, a few pounds of coffee, and some sugar, a cock and 3 hens, some cooking utensils, a little crockery, matches, and an old main course, which, with the axes, shovels, picks, rope, blocks, and spars used in securing the treasure, and which still remained on shore, ought, we considered, to furnish them with the means to make themselves fairly comfortable until they should be taken off. This important matter decided, the next thing was to get everything up and passed into the boat, a task which fully occupied us until daylight, by which time the effects of the carouse showed signs of passing off, and the men began to awake in a measure to a consciousness of their situation. A few of them, Rogers, Moore, and O'Connor especially, gave vent to their indignation and disgust in a continuous flood of the vilest language, mingled with blood-curdling threats of the vengeance that they would wreak upon us some time in the future, but the rest accepted their impending fate with sullen stoicism. We, meanwhile, comfortably conscious that, for the present at least, they were utterly powerless to fulfill any of their threats, or otherwise work us any evil, went composedly on with our work, first conveying to and landing all the baggage on the sandy beach of the creek, and then ferrying the marooned men ashore, with their hands securely lashed behind them. We had determined to land only 8 of them, and when this had been done, and we were all ready to leave them, we cut the bonds of the last man ashore, and left him to free his companions at leisure, thus effectually ensuring ourselves against any trouble from the maroon party at the last moment. Then, having shouted to them a parting promise that we would make known the fact of their presence on the island to the first British man-of-war we met with, together with the cause of their being left there, we paddled quietly on board again, and set to work to provide ourselves with a much-needed breakfast. End of Chapter 17. Recording by Dave Wills. Chapter 18 of The Cruise of the Esmeralda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Wills. The Cruise of the Esmeralda, Chapter 18, A Pacific Hurricane. Our meal over, the 3 remaining prisoners were released and offered their choice between being landed on the island to join the other men and returning to duty. I reminded them that their conduct in having aided and abetted the more active amongst the mutineers to seize the ship rendered them guilty of the crime of piracy, a crime punishable with death, and that it still remained with me to clap them in irons, if I pleased, and keep them prisoners until an opportunity should arrive to hand them over to justice, charged with that offence. I added that as it appeared, however, that they, the 3 men in question, seemed only to have passively consented to the deed of the others, I had no desire to be severe with them. I was anxious rather to give them an opportunity of retrieving their character, and would willingly do so, could I but feel assured that, separated as they would be from their more guilty comrades, they would henceforth serve me faithfully. I said that if they were prepared to do this, I, on my part, was willing to forgive them their share in the mutiny, and to treat them as though the incident had never occurred. I warned them, however, that unless they were fully prepared not only to solemnly pledge themselves to fidelity, but also to faithfully fulfill that pledge, it would be infinitely better for them to elect to be landed on the island, to take their chance with the rest. For I assured them that, should they take the pledge of fidelity and afterwards break it, I would, upon the first symptom of insubordination, clap them in irons and hand them over to the authorities as pirates at the first port we might happen to touch. This address had precisely the effect upon the fellows that I desired. The mention of the word piracy and the reminder of the penalty due to that crime thoroughly frightened them, while my promise, on the other hand, of forgiveness as the reward for faithful service in the future had all the reassuring influence that I intended it to have. And upon the conclusion of my lecture, they, with one accord, begged my pardon for what had already happened, and most fervently promised that I should have no cause of complaint against them in the future. This important matter settled thus far to my satisfaction, I sent Barque and Christiansen aloft to loose the fore topsail and topgallantsail, while Joe and the negro performed a similar duty on the mainmast, both parties receiving instructions to cast off the lashings from the staysails on their way down. Whilst this was doing, Forbes lay out on the jib boom and loosed the jib and fore topmast staysail, I busying myself meanwhile in casting loose the mizzen. Presently Joe hailed from aloft that the men on shore had made their appearance on the beach, and upon looking in that direction I saw the whole party of them gathered there, close to the water's edge, intently watching our movements. Just then Sir Edgar made his appearance on deck, and with a cheery "Good morning," laughingly declared that he intended to ship for the voyage to the nearest port as an honorary seaman, and was ready to enter upon his duties at once. I, of course, thanked him for this kind proffer of his services, assuring him that, short-handed as we were, it would be in his power to render us invaluable assistance. And the hands at that moment coming down from aloft, we sheeted home the topsails and got the yards to the mastheads. Nothing now remained but to loose our hold upon the ground and make a start. This we could, of course, at once do by simply slipping the cable. But an anchor is altogether too useful an article to be needlessly thrown away. Many a good ship has driven ashore and gone to pieces for want of an anchor that has been slipped and not replaced. I was, therefore, very much averse to slipping in the present instance, without at least trying to get the anchor. On putting the question to the others, Forbes had no doubt of our ability to do it, while the rest expressed their perfect readiness to try. We accordingly manned the windlass, and San Domingo, starting a lively shanty, walked the Barque up to her anchor almost without an effort. Having got the cable up and down, we next ran up the fore topmast staysail, and then went to the fore braces and trimmed the head yards for casting the ship to starboard. Just then, and in the very nick of time, Miss Merivale came on deck, looking as bright and radiant as the morning itself, and I at once impressed her as helmswoman, stationing her at the wheel and briefly explaining how she was to act upon the receipt of certain signals from me. She seemed quite proud at the idea that she could be really useful, and took her station at the wheel with a heightened colour and sparkling eyes, which, with her spotless white dress, trimmed with dainty lace and light blue ribbons, her broad-brimmed hat set jauntily upon the heavy coils of her dusky golden hair, and casting a delicate shadow upon her lovely face, her hands and arms encased in long loose gloves, and her delicate feet shod in small brown shoes, made her, to my mind, the sweetest, loveliest picture that my eyes had ever rested upon. So irresistibly charming indeed did she look that I with difficulty forbore from telling her so, plump and plain, and so, to avoid the committal of such an impertinence, was constrained to rush forward and add my weight to that of the others at the windlass handles in their efforts to break out the anchor. Fortunately for us, our windlass was an exceptionally good and powerful one, but on the other hand the holding ground proved to be exceptionally tenacious, and for a long 5 minutes the cable stood straight up and down, rigid as a solid bar, defying our utmost efforts to get so much as a single additional pull. Then an opportune puff, with a little more weight in it than the soft breathing off the land that had hitherto reached us, struck the broad expanses of our topsails, and with a sudden jerk the ground broke away and the anchor came home.
"Hurrah, lads! She's away! Heave for your lives! Heave and raise the dead!"
vociferated Forbes. The windlass pawls clanked merrily, the chain came rattling in through the hawse-pipe, and the ship, gathering sternway, began to pay off with her head to seaward. At the right moment I signed to Miss Merivale to put the wheel hard up, while Forbes and I sprang aft to the braces and swung the yards. The ship halted, hung stationary for a moment, and then, gathering headway, gradually swept round until we had brought the island upon our starboard beam, and were gliding along under the lee of its western shore. Our new voyage had begun. The marooned men had all this time been intently watching our movements from the beach, and from their excited actions and the way in which they closed up in a circle when they saw our canvas drop from the yards, it was apparent that they were engaged in a heated discussion of some kind. Presently, when they saw us man the windlass and heard the clink of its pawls, I observed O'Connor break from the conclave, dash his cap down upon the sand, and somewhat hesitantly enter the water, as though about attempting to swim off to us. Whereupon I sprang upon the rail, and putting the whole power of my lungs into the shout, hailed him to go back, as there were sharks in the bay. I had to repeat this warning 2 or 3 times, however, before he seemed willing to heed it, and it was not, in fact, until the anchor was broken out of the ground, and the ship was seen to be canting to seaward, that he turned back and rejoined his companions. When we last saw them, they were still standing upon the beach, watching our departure, and shouting to us with gestures that were eloquent of threats and curses, though we were too far distant to catch the words they hurled after us. Meanwhile, during the progress of these operations, I had been taking counsel with myself as to the most desirable course to pursue under the circumstances in which we found ourselves. My original intention had been to proceed to Valparaiso in quest of a crew, but that intention had been arrived at under the impression that it would be necessary only to leave 3 or 4 men behind us on the island. Joe's opinion upon the matter had, however, altered all this, and had necessitated our going to sea with a crew of only 7 men, including Sir Edgar, whose assistance I felt we could only claim under circumstances of exceptional necessity. This reduced us to 2 watches of 3 men each, who might indeed suffice to handle the ship under easy canvas and during fine weather, but who could do very little with her should we happen to fall in with a heavy gale, or still worse, a downright Pacific hurricane. Then, too, the prevailing winds in that part of the world are easterly, which placed Valparaiso well to windward, and rendered it even more difficult to fetch than San Francisco. The latter port, however, I had no desire whatever to visit under the circumstances, with such a precious cargo on board, and 3 men at least whose tongues it would be impossible to bridle. By the time, therefore, that the ship was fairly under way, I had come to the conclusion that my best plan would be to make for the Sandwich Islands, which were only some 1,650 miles distant in a northwesterly direction, and might therefore be easily reached in a fortnight if all went well with us. An important advantage attaching to this plan was that Honolulu, if it did not lie directly in my road to China, was nearer it than any other port, and I still considered it very essential that, in order to avoid inconvenient questions, I should take home a cargo of some sort, which might as well be tea as anything else, and although I had never visited the Sandwich Islands, I thought it probable I should there be able to pick up at least a sufficient number of men to carry us comfortably to the Canton River. As soon, therefore, as we were fairly clear of the island, I set the course for the island of Oahu, the wind being at that time a 4-knot breeze well over the starboard quarter. This done, I relieved Miss Merrivale at the wheel, leaving Forbes and the other 4 men to continue at leisure in the operation of making sail. Meanwhile, the question had arisen, how was the cooking to be done? And the natural reply to this seemed to be, set the darky to do it. This would have been all very well, but for my passengers, who, it occurred to me, might possibly have a prejudice against having their food handled by a black man. I therefore laid the matter before Sir Edgar, who immediately consulted with his wife, and the ultimate result was that one of the maids very good-naturedly undertook the work, with San Domingo as cook's mate, to do all the dirty work, while the other maid volunteered as steward. I was greatly distressed in my mind lest all these inconveniences should prove a serious annoyance to my good friends in the saloon. But on mentioning the matter to Lady Emily, she quickly and kindly reassured me by declaring that they looked upon the whole thing in the light of an adventure or experience of a novel kind to be made the most of. Besides, she added, a little inconvenience and privation will do us good by teaching us to appreciate our comforts more nearly at their proper value when we get them again. The weather looked fine, and the barometer stood high. I therefore had no hesitation whatever about packing sail upon the ship, and as everybody worked with a will, it came to pass that by noon we had not only got our anchor secured, but had also clothed the ship with every stitch of plain sail, from the royals down. Forbes was not satisfied even with that, and would have gone on to studding sails, but I considered enough to be as good as a feast. Studding sails are rather ungainly things to handle in a quickly freshening breeze, if one happens to be at all short-handed. I therefore determined to have nothing to do with them, the more resolutely that, as we drew away from the island, the breeze strengthened until we were reeling off our 9 knots by the log. This exceedingly satisfactory state of affairs prevailed for exactly 40 hours from noon of the day upon which we left the island, the breeze remaining so steady and true that we were not called upon to touch tack, sheet, or halyard during the whole time. There was nothing, in fact, to do but simply steer the ship, and we were already beginning to flatter ourselves that we were not only going to be favoured with a pleasant passage, but that we were going to accomplish it in about half the time that I had allotted to it. Such a magnificent opportunity was not to be wasted, and I accordingly took advantage of it to have the ballast cleared away right in midships, and the gold and silver stowed there equally on each side of the keelson, and carefully concealed with matting and a quantity of dunnage, after which the ballast was trimmed back over it, and everything left ship-shape against the time of our arrival in port. In hoping for a sufficiently long continuance of fine weather to carry us without break or interruption to Honolulu, however, we were reckoning without our host, for about 4 o'clock in the morning of our second day out, the wind began to fail us, and by 8 o'clock it had fallen to a stark, glassy calm. There had been but a moderate amount of sea running, and this soon went down, leaving only a long, oily swell, upon which the ship rolled with a quick, jerky, uneasy movement. The sun rose clear and brilliant, with every promise of a fine and scorchingly hot day. But when I went on deck after breakfast to take my sights for the longitude, I noticed that the sky had lost much of its brilliant colouring, while the sun hung in it a white, shapeless blotch, instead of the dazzling orb that had risen a few hours before. This, of course, might mean nothing worse than heat, but when I went below, shortly afterwards, to work out my sights, I saw that the mercury had fallen a little. This, too, might only mean heat, with possibly a smart thunderstorm a little later on in the day. But short-handed as we were, I deemed it best to be on the safe side, and accordingly, having worked out my sights, I returned to the deck, and all hands of us went to work upon the canvas, clewing up and hauling down all our lighter sails, until we had stripped the ship to topsails, courses, fore-topmast, staysail, jib, and mizzen. At this stage of the proceedings, another glance at the barometer showed that the mercury was still shrinking in the tube, while the atmosphere had assumed a hazy appearance that rendered it difficult to distinguish the horizon. There could no longer be any doubt that a change of weather was impending, although there was nothing at present to indicate very precisely what the character of the change was to be. We therefore went aloft, 3 of us on the foremast and 3 on the main, and beginning with the royals and working downward, snugly stowed everything that we had previously hauled down. It was whilst we were thus engaged that an increasing uneasiness in the motion of the ship first became apparent, and looking about us for the cause, we became aware of the fact that a cross-swell had begun to gather, and was slowly creeping down to us from the northwest, the sure precursor, Forbes affirmed, of a stiff blow from that quarter. In this opinion I fully agreed. Still, there was at that moment nothing of a menacing character in the aspect of the sky, beyond an increasing thickness of the atmosphere, and I was, therefore, hopeful that we should have a sufficiency of time given us to complete our preparations for the worst that could happen, before it came upon us. The furling of the light canvas was neither a very long nor a very laborious job, and in less than an hour we were all once more on deck. The northwesterly swell had by this time gathered sufficient weight to render itself distinctly perceptible, even to the eye, and the ship having swung round broadside onto it, she was rolling in a fashion that set all the trusses, parrels, and bulkheads creaking, the yards jerking, the patent block sheaves squeaking, the heavy canvas flapping, the reef points pattering, the cabin doors rattling, and the wheel chains clanking, so that, with the heavy wash of water along the bends and under the counter, and an occasional clatter of crockery in the pantry, quite a small babel of sound was raised about us. The motion of the ship, however, though more violent, was not so awkward and uncomfortable as it had been, doubtless in consequence of the young swell killing the old, and still there was no sign whatever of an immediate breeze. But another look at the barometer showed that the mercury was still falling, and now at a more rapid rate. Fully convinced, therefore, that something rather more serious than a mere thunder-squall was brewing, we now went to work with a will, and having first furled the mizzen, hauled up the courses and stowed them, leaving the ship with nothing showing but her 2 topsails, and the fore-topmast staysail, which, as our topsails were patent reefing, left us practically prepared for almost anything that might happen. The haze had by this time thickened overhead to such an extent that the sun showed in it as a mere white rayless disk, the light of which seemed to be gradually dying out, and by the time that noon had arrived the atmosphere had become so obscure that the horizon was no longer distinguishable, and I therefore lost my observation for the latitude. At 1 o'clock, when our neat stewardess summoned me below to luncheon, the mercury was still sinking, which, with the slow progress of the change that was taking place, assured me that when the outburst came it would be something a little out of the common. Luckily we had plenty of sea room and a thoroughly staunch little ship under our feet. I therefore looked forward to the impending conflict with tolerable equanimity. At length, just as I had completed my hasty lunch, there occurred a sudden but perceptible darkening of the atmosphere, which seemed to indicate that the expected change was now imminent, and springing up the companionway to the deck, I found a most extraordinary scene awaiting me. The thickness that had hitherto pervaded the atmosphere had vanished, as if by magic, leaving the air astonishingly clear and transparent right to the boundary of the horizon, and revealing a vast expanse of dense, livid, purple-grey cloud, which had overspread the northwestern half of the heavens, and was at that precise moment passing over and shutting out the sun from view. The edge of the cloud was as straight and sharply defined as though it had been trimmed with a knife, and it divided the firmament into two almost equal portions, the larger of which was a beautiful expanse of clear, serene, unclouded blue, while the other hung livid and threatening above us, with the promise of a raving tornado lurking within its black bosom. Immediately overhead, the colour of this immense cloud curtain was a cold, slaty blue, from whence, as the eye travelled down its expanse towards the northwestern horizon, the hue became darker, until where it met the water it was as black as night, while underneath it the sea undulated restlessly with the writhings of an angry serpent, showing a surface as lustreless and of the same colour as molten lead. Low down in the bosom of the cloud could be seen occasional palpitating quiverings, as though the fires within it were striving to burst their way through, and presently, quite at the horizon, a flash of lightning sparked vividly out of it.
"Are the topsail halyards all ready for running, Mr. Forbes?"
said I.
"All ready, sir,"
was the reply, and turning away, the mate walked quietly forward, throwing the falls off the pins on his way. A minute later I heard him telling Joe to stand by the fore topsail halyards, and the rest of the men to lay aft to the braces, following them along the deck and stationing himself at the main topsail halyards, in readiness to let them run. At this moment Sir Edgar, with the two ladies and the children, came on deck and looked around with startled eyes upon the portentous scene. But upon my earnest recommendation the youngsters were at once sent below again, the ladies holding themselves in readiness to follow at a moment's notice. Sir Edgar, however, announced his determination to remain on deck upon the chance of his becoming useful, upon which Lady Emily, without saying a word, went below and brought up on deck not only her husband's but also my own mackintosh coat, a little piece of thoughtful consideration for which I was deeply grateful, since the aspect of the weather was now such that I dared not leave the deck for a single instant. Slowly the great cloud worked its insidious way athwart the heavens until nearly 3/4 of the firmament was obscured. Yet still there was not air enough to have extinguished a burning match. Then, while the barque was lying helpless, with her head pointing directly towards the quarter from which we expected the outfly, a white mist suddenly appeared ahead, sweeping down upon us with the speed of an express train, its course along the water indicated by a long line of continuous white.
"Here comes the rain at last!"
exclaimed Forbes, turning to me and pointing ahead with one hand as he grasped the fall of the main topsail halyards with the other.
"Aye, and the wind with it,"
I answered him as I sprang to the wheel and whirled it hard over.
"Let go your topsail halyards! Away below, ladies, for your lives! The gale will be upon us in less than a minute. Lay aft here, some of you, and round in upon the larboard fore braces. Mr. Forbes, get the starboard fore topsail stay-sheets aft and well belayed, if you please. Whew, here it is. Hold on, everybody."
The rain seemed to reach us a single instant ahead of the wind, dashing vertically down upon us. For just that brief period, not in drops, but in an overwhelming deluge that I verily believe must have drowned us had it lasted. Then, as the hurricane reached us in a deafening melody of sound, the sheets of water were caught and swept horizontally along with a force that it was literally impossible to face without the risk of being blinded, while the barque gathered stern way until the water was piled up level with her taffrail, and for a few breathless seconds I was firmly convinced that it would end in our foundering stern foremost. The good little ship was paying off all the time, however, and presently she had swept round until we had it fairly abeam, and then she laid down to it until her lee lower yard arms were dipping in the water. Then, signing to the men at the braces to haul round the head yards, I waited until she had lost her stern way, and then I shifted the helm, putting it hard up, and she began to draw slowly ahead. The danger was now practically over, for the ship continued to pay off, and presently she righted with a sudden jerk and went foaming away before it, with the white froth level with her hawse-pipes. The rain was by this time over, and while all was still thick as a hedge ahead and to leeward of us, the atmosphere astern was clear, save for the spindrift and scud-water with which it was heavily loaded along the water surface. The first mad fury of the outfly was past, but even so it was blowing harder than I had ever seen it blow before. So hard, indeed, that I wondered at the brave way in which the close-reefed topsails withstood the tremendous strain and drag of the ship upon them. So great was this strain that I began to entertain very serious fears for the masts, and now that it was too late, deeply regretted that I had not stripped the ship entirely bare and faced the outfly under bare poles. And it would have been a positive relief to me to have seen both topsails go flying out of the bolt-ropes. They still held on, however, and Forbes, having at my request gone the round of the chain-plates and subjected them to a careful examination, reported that he could see no sign of any of the bolts drawing. I began to hope that, after all, we might pull through without any very serious damage, especially as Joe, almost immediately afterward, sounded the pumps and reported that everything was right below. We had been scudding for about an hour when the sea began to rise, and by 5 o'clock in the afternoon there was a very high, steep sea following us, which I foresaw would soon become dangerous. I therefore determined to watch for an opportunity, and, if possible, heave the ship to before dark. As a preliminary to this manoeuvre, I ordered the fore-topmast staysail to be hauled down, and this having been accomplished without damage to the sail, 2 of the men, Barque and the Swede, lay out upon the bowsprit to stow it, under the direction of the mate. This, at the moment that the order was given, seemed a perfectly simple affair, and entirely free from danger. It unfortunately happened, however, just at the moment when the sail had been made secure and the men were on the point of laying in again, as Forbes subsequently informed me, that an unusually heavy sea overtook us, and catching the Barque under her counter, raised her stern high in the air, slightly pooping us, while it buried her bows and bowsprit deep in the water. Standing at the wheel, I saw what was about to happen, and was in the very act of shouting a warning to the men to hold on, when the sea curled in over the taffrail, completely burying me for the moment, and when, a few seconds later, I was able to clear my eyes of water, both men had vanished, and Forbes was running aft, crying out to me that they were overboard. I looked astern, but could see nothing of either of them, nor, in the increasingly perilous situation of the ship, dared I leave the wheel even for the brief space of time requisite to cut adrift and throw overboard a lifebuoy. Forbes, however, dashed aft and did this with most commendable promptitude, after which he, with the assistance of Joe and San Domingo, lost not a moment in counter-bracing the yards, when we successfully brought the ship to the larboard tack with her fore topsails aback. This done, and with Joe at the wheel, Forbes and I clambered into the maintop and peered long into the fast-gathering gloom, in the faint hope that even yet we might catch sight of one or both of the missing men, and be able to do something to save them. But we never saw either of them again. End of Chapter 18, recorded by Dave Wills.
Chapter 19 of The Cruise of the Esmeralda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marty on the central coast of California. The Cruise of the Esmeralda by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 19, In Dire Extremity. The sudden loss of these 2 men was not only a terrible shock to us all, it was also a cruel misfortune, for, elusive of Sir Edgar, it left only 4 of us to handle the ship. It is true that we were now as snug as it was possible to be, and in a condition to face almost anything that might befall us in the shape of weather. But when it again came to a question of making sail, or still worse, being obliged to once more shorten sail, perhaps in a hurry, there would be a good deal of heavy labor, all to be done by 4, or at most 5 men. It was, however, one of those deplorable accidents that are incidental to the life of a seaman, and having in the meantime done all that was possible for the safety of the ship, it was useless to meet our troubles halfway, and I therefore arranged that during the continuance of the gale, while there would be really nothing to do but to keep an eye upon the ship, the regular watches should be taken by the 4 of us in rotation, one at a time, which would thus allow the others plenty of time for rest against the moment when the utmost exertions of all would once more be demanded. The darkness fell upon us with a suddenness that was almost startling. I had been for some time, ever since we had hove to, in fact, narrowly watching the ship to see how she met the seas. But at length, finding that she was taking care of herself, I ordered Joe to lash the wheel, and gave him permission to go below and join the others at supper in the forecastle. Before finally releasing him, however, and assuming my solitary watch, I thought I would have another look at the mercury. I accordingly went below into the saloon, where the lamps were already lighted, glanced at the barometer, and saw that the mercury was now stationary, chatted for a minute or 2 with the occupants of the apartment, and then went on deck again. When I left the deck a few minutes before, the horizon and the forms of the flying clouds were clearly distinguishable, but now, when I returned to it again, the blackness of impenetrable darkness was all round about me, relieved only by the ghostly light of the pale sea fire in the foaming wave crests, and in the tiny stars of phosphorescent light that went careering to leeward across the deck with every lee roll of the ship. It was a weird and awe-inspiring sensation to stand there in the blackness upon the wildly heaving deck, and watch the irresistible, menacing onrush upon the ship of those furious mountain surges, capped with ghostly green fire, with the deafening shriek and din of the gale in the unseen rigging overhead resounding in one's ears, a sensation well calculated to bring home to a man his own nothingness in presence of the power and majesty of Him who causeth the vapours to ascend from the ends of the earth, who maketh lightnings for the rain, who bringeth forth the wind out of his treasuries, who hath his way in the whirlwind and the storm, who holdeth the sea in the hollow of his hand. And this feeling was in no wise lessened, nay, it was rather intensified, by the thrill of exultation I experienced at the reflection that man, puny as is his strength compared with the mighty forces of nature, has been endowed by his Creator with an intellect capable of devising and framing a structure so subtly molded and so strongly put together that it is able to face and triumphantly survive such a mad fury of wind and sea as then raged around me. Throughout the greater part of the night the gale continued to blow with unabated fury, but about 3 o'clock on the following morning a rapid rise of the barometer commenced, and some 2 hours later a single star twinkling brightly for a moment through a small rift in the hitherto unbroken cloud-rack overhead gave welcome assurance that the worst of the weather was now over, an assurance which was shortly afterwards strengthened by a slight but unmistakable decrease in the violence of the wind. Then a few more stars beamed mildly down upon us for brief but lengthening intervals, and finally, about half an hour before the time of sunrise, the great pall of cloud broke up into squadrons of tattered streamers speeding swiftly athwart the sky, which, away down in the eastern quarter, was rapidly paling before the dawn. Anon the pallor became tinged with a chilly hue of yellow, against which the mountainous sea reared itself in vast, sharply defined ridges of blackest indigo, paling, as the eye travelled round the horizon toward the western quarter, into a deep blue-grey, capped with lofty, curling crests of pallid foam. Quickly the cold yellow along the eastern horizon became flushed with streaks of angry red. The flying squadrons of rent grey cloud became fringed along their lower edges with dyes of purple and crimson, and presently the upper rim of the sun's disk, copper-hued and fiery, gleamed through the flying wrack low down upon the horizon, flashing a cheerless ray of angry orange across the mountain waste of waters, changing it into a heaving, turbulent surface of sickly olive green. It was as dreary, cheerless a sunrise, I think, as I had ever seen. The air, still full of spindrift, was, despite our position only a few degrees north of the line, chill enough to set one shuddering. The main deck was all awash with water that flew incessantly over the weather bow and poured aft with the heaving of the ship, breaking into miniature cascades among the booms lashed in the waist, and over the lengths of cable stretched along the decks from the windlass to the chain locker, swirling round the pumps and the foot of the mainmast, and gurgling and sobbing in the lee scuppers. The weather bulwarks were streaming with water. Even the topsails were dark with wet. Miniature showers were blowing away to leeward off the top of the galley and forward deckhouse, and the few dry spots that were to be found here and there about the decks in sheltered places were white with encrusted salt. It was still blowing heavily. The ship was plunging furiously and rolling so wildly that it was impossible to maintain one's footing without clinging to something. The continuous raving of the wind among the maze of spars and rigging, especially when the ship rolled to windward, was most depressing to listen to, and the appalling proportions of the vast liquid mountain ranges that, with dreary, persistent, remorseless monotony, came sweeping down upon us from the northward and westward, piling their hissing crests high around us, completed a picture with, for dreary sublimity, I had never seen equaled. I was tired, and wet, and cold, for notwithstanding our arrangement of the watches, I had been on deck off and on the whole night. I was not sorry, therefore, when Forbes came on deck to relieve me at 8 o'clock, thus affording me an opportunity to shift into dry clothes before sitting down to breakfast. We were rather a small company that morning, Sir Edgar and Miss Merivale being the only members of the saloon party who felt equal to the putting in of an appearance, and after breakfast I was obliged, rather unwillingly I confess, to go on deck again to secure an observation of the sun, which observation, when worked out, showed that we were nearly 30 miles to the eastward of our proper position. This ascertained, I retired to my cabin, and, flinging myself upon the bunk, all standing, instantly sank into a dreamless, refreshing sleep. It appeared to me that I had not been in my berth more than 5 minutes, when about a quarter of an hour before noon, Forbes called me in order that we might together take the meridian altitude of the sun, and I was no sooner on my feet than it became apparent that the ship's motion was by no means so violent as it had been when I lay down, which was sufficiently accounted for by the information imparted to me by the mate that the gale had broken, and that in another hour or two the weather would probably have moderated sufficiently to permit of our filling away upon our course. This news was fully confirmed by the general aspect of affairs when I reached the deck, for the sun was now shining brilliantly in a cloudless sky, and the air was genially warm, while the wind, though still blowing heavily enough to justify us in retaining the close reefs in the topsails, had abated its violence so far that it now blew steadily instead of beating upon the ship in gusts of headlong fury. The sea, moreover, though it still seemed to run as high as ever, was no longer so steep as it had been, the great mountains of water moving more slowly, and carrying a good wholesome slope on their lee sides that enabled the ship to ride them easily and comfortably without the provocation of a constantly recurring feeling that each great menacing wall of water was about to overwhelm her. We had taken the sun and made it 8 bells, and as I was on the point of leaving the deck again to work out the sights in my own cabin, when, while exchanging some remarks with Forbes, I thought I caught a momentary glimpse of something, what I knew not, as the ship hung poised for an instant upon the crest of an unusually heavy wave. It was but the barest, most fleeting glimpse, for before I could direct Forbes' attention to it by so much as a word, we were plunging headlong down the weather slope of the wave, with our horizon on either hand bounced by a hissing crest that was rearing itself as high as our maintop, and the barque taking a weather roll of such portentous extent that both of us instinctively made a dash for the mizzen shrouds and clung to them for dear life in anticipation of the coming and correspondingly abnormal lee roll, while the roar of the bow wave and the wind aloft created such a din that I could not have made myself heard even had I been foolish enough to have attempted it. But I was confident that I had seen something, and when the ship reached the bottom of the abyss, where we on deck were becalmed, and the roar of the surge under our bows had died away, I mentioned the matter to the mate, so that when we were swung aloft again, both of us were eagerly on the lookout for the object. As almost invariably happens, however, after the passage of an unusually heavy wave, the 2 or 3 that now succeeded were only of moderate height, and higher crests each time intervened between us and the spot where the object was last seen. It was also probable enough that the object, whatever it might be, would be sunk in the trough of the sea just at the moment when we happened to be hanging on a wave crest. And it thus happened that several minutes elapsed without my again catching sight of it. To cut the matter short, therefore, I handed Forbes my sextant to hold, and, seizing a favourable opportunity, sprang into the weather main rigging and swarmed aloft as far as the maintop, from which elevation I knew that I should soon sight it if it were still above the water. It was not until I was halfway up the shrouds that I fully realized how heavily it was still blowing, or how violent still was the motion of the ship. With every lee roll that we took, I was involuntarily forced to cling with all my strength to the rigging, for it seemed to me that unless I did so, I should infallibly be pitched head foremost into the top, while when the ship rolled to the windward, the pressure of the air upon my body was so great that I was literally jammed hard and fast against the rigging, unable to move hand or foot. This was even more apparent when I reached the futtock shrouds, and was surmounting the edge of the top, the wind sustaining me so completely that I am confident I might have relaxed my hand grasp for several seconds without the slightest danger of falling. However, I gained my lofty perch at last, and, lying prone in the top, in order that I might see under the foot of the fore topsail, soon again caught sight of the object. It was distant about 7 miles from the ship, bearing about north-northeast by compass, and floated very low in the water, a circumstance which, from the thick mist still overspreading the surface of the water, rendered it impossible at that distance to determine precisely what it was. It looked as much like a dead whale as anything else, and had I felt quite certain that it was really this, I should of course have troubled no more about it. But there were moments when, probably from some slight change in its position with regard to us, the resemblance I have mentioned ceased, and the conviction forced itself upon me that, whatever it might be, it was not a whale, living or dead, and at length, to set the matter at rest, I determined to fill upon the ship and get a nearer look at it. I accordingly descended to the deck, and Forbes, rousing out Joe and San Domingo, we all went to work, and with some difficulty succeeded in setting the fore-topmast staysail without splitting it, after which we filled the fore-topsail and headed the ship for the mysterious object. We were now close hauled upon the larboard tack, with the object a bare 3 points upon the lee bow, and it soon became apparent that, as we were making fully that amount of leeway, it would require some rather fine steering to fetch it without breaking tacks, an operation which I was particularly anxious to avoid, short-handed as we were. Forbes, however, was at the wheel, and as he was a splendid helmsman, it was pretty certain that if the thing could be done, he would do it. When luncheon was announced, we had drawn up to within about 4 miles of the object, but so heavily was the sea still running that, even at that distance, it was only occasionally that we could catch sight of it, presenting now, as looked as through the ship's telescope, the appearance of a large fragment of floating wreck. The news which I took to the luncheon table, that a mysterious floating something of considerable size had been sighted ahead, and that we were making for it, had a very stimulating effect upon the occupants of the saloon, who, enveloping themselves in mackintoshes, followed me on deck when I rose from the table, with an eagerness born of the longing for some occurrence to break the monotony of, and make them forget for a time, the wearisome pitching and rolling of the ship, the monotonous, unceasing clank and jar of the cabin doors on their hooks, the continuous creaking of the bulkheads, the thump of the wheel chains on the deck, the never-ending wash of the water and the howling of the wind in the rigging, and, despite the merciless buffeting of the wind and the ceaseless drenching showers of spray that flew over us, the change from the saloon to the deck was unanimously voted an improvement, for it involved a transition from a close, oppressive atmosphere to an exhilarating breeze, redolent of the strong salt odor of the brine, and bracing by reason of its very violence, while the brilliant sunshine, sparkling upon the deep, windy blue of the vast mountain surges that surrounded us, and converting every spray shower into a gorgeous rainbow, constituted an ever-changing picture of rich and splendid color and wild, tumultuous movement that was not to be easily forgotten. I thought that Miss Merrivale had never looked so lovely as she did then, enveloped in a thin, soft, silky-looking mackintosh, with a dainty little close-fitting hat upon her head, her beautiful hair all blown adrift and streaming, a long golden web of ringlets in the fiery breeze, her cheeks flushed to a delicate pink with the rude buffeting of the wind and sea, and her eyes fairly blazing with excitement and exhilaration at the wild scene around her. Our first glances were naturally directed ahead in search of the mysterious object for which we were steering, and it was quickly discovered about 2 miles distant, and a good point on the lee bow. To the unaided eye its character still remained uncertain, but a single glance through the ship's telescope now sufficed to satisfy us that it was a wreck, or a portion of one. It had all the appearance of a small craft, capsized, for the telescope enabled one to see a small strip of wet, black side showing above water, with a considerably greater expanse of copper-sheathed planking. But, even now that we had so greatly decreased the distance between us and it, there was still great difficulty in determining its precise character, for it was only when we and it happened to be upon the top of a sea at the same moment that it came within our ken, and those moments were comparatively rare. As we continued to close, however, our glimpses of it became increasingly frequent, and at length, when we had approached to within half a mile, the heave of the sea having meanwhile flung it round into a more favourable position, it became apparent that it was a small craft of some sort, seemingly a brig, that had capsized, and now lay with her masts prone along the water, for we could now and then catch a glimpse of the spars, with the canvas still set, lifting a foot or two out of the water with the heave of the sea, only to settle back down again the next moment, however. What interested us most keenly of all, however, and excited our profoundest astonishment, was the fact that the dark patch in her main rigging, for which I could not at first account, soon afterwards proved to be a group of men, for we presently saw one of them scramble along the shrouds until he reached the vessel's upturned side, and then, despite the heavy masses of water that were continually breaking over the hull, rise to his feet and wave something that looked like a man's jacket, by way of a signal, in answer to which I immediately ran our ensign up to the gaff end. The excitement of the fairer occupants of our poop was now intense, especially that of Miss Merrivale, who, in the extremity and oblivion of her enthusiasm, not only addressed me as Jack, but also volunteered to do all sorts of impossible things by way of assisting in the rescue that she took for granted. But how was such a thing to be achieved? We were only 5 men on board the Esmeralda, all told, and what could our united efforts accomplish? We certainly could not launch a boat, even had we dared to hope that so small a craft would live in such a wild and fearful sea, for the lightest of our gigs, the only boat it would have been possible to launch under the circumstances, would need at least 4 men to do anything with her in such weather, which would leave only 1 man on board to look after and handle the ship during the process of rescue, which amounted to a physical impossibility. I was, however, determined to save the men, if it could be done. We therefore steered the barque as close up under the lee of the wreck as we dared, and backed our mainyard, with the brig's royal mastheads showing just awash, not 10 feet to windward of us. It was an extraordinary and appalling picture that we now looked upon. The vessel, a brig of about 180 tons, had been thrown over on her starboard side, and now lay submerged to about halfway up her hatchways, with her masts prone along the water, into and out of which they dipped and rose 2 or 3 feet with the wash of the sea and the roll of the hull. She was a wooden vessel, apparently American built, and was under whole topsails, foresail, spanker, and jib, which sufficiently accounted for her present predicament, if, as seemed probable, she had been caught under that canvas in the outburst of the previous day. She had no quarter davits, and the chocks over the main hatchway, where the long boat and sometimes the jolly boat as well is usually stowed, were missing. But the grips were still there, showing that the boat or boats that had been stowed there had evidently been washed away. There was, moreover, the remains of what had once been a gig on her gallows. She appeared to have been generously fitted up, for, as she rose and fell, we caught the flash of brasswork about her skylight and companion, and when her stern lifted high enough out of the water, a handsome brass binnacle, securely bolted to the deck, became exposed to our view. Lastly, huddled in her weather-main rigging, about 12 or 15 feet from the rail, where they were tolerably clear of the seas that constantly broke over the vessel's upturned side, was a group of 9 men, most of them bareheaded, clad in garments that clung to their bodies with the tenacity of clothing that has been soaked for many consecutive hours in water. They were in a miserable and most precarious plight indeed, and I could not help wondering how they had possibly managed to cling for so many hours to so insecure a refuge, assuming, of course, that the brig had capsized on the previous afternoon, as I surmised. The first thing was to communicate with them, and this I attempted by means of the speaking trumpet, but the roar of the wind and the wash of the sea, together with our drift, which was of course much more rapid than that of the wreck, rendered my voice inaudible, so it became necessary to resort to other methods. There happened to be a bull-board kicking about the poop, and setting this up on the skylight, where it could be distinctly seen, with its black face towards the wreck, I got a piece of chalk, and hastily wrote upon it the following words, one after the other, receiving a wave of the hand from those on the wreck, in token that they had deciphered each word, before I obliterated it and wrote the next. Only 4 men on board, so cannot send boat. Will stand by and take you off if possible. By the time that this last word of communication had been written and acknowledged, we were some distance to leeward of the wreck, and it became necessary to fill upon the ship once more. This done, the next matter for determination was the means whereby we were to get the people away from the wreck, and safe on board the barque, a problem which, had we been fully manned, would have proved sufficiently puzzling, while, circumstanced as we were, it seemed all but impossible. At length, however, I hit upon a scheme that I thought might be worth trying, and we proceeded forthwith to put it into practical shape without more ado. Since the unfortunate people on the wreck were in a perilously exposed situation, and evidently in such a terribly exhausted state that they might relax their hold and be washed away at any moment. There were, as I have already mentioned, 9 men to be rescued. Now, the Esmeralda, having been, ever since she was launched, a passenger ship, was well found in life-saving appliances, life buoys among the number, of which we carried no less than 12, 8 being stowed away in one of the cutters on the gallows, while the remainder were distributed about the poop, ready for immediate use. The first thing done was to get up on deck 2 good stout warps and bend them end to end so that we might have plenty of length to work with, and the inner end of this long line was then made fast inboard at the fore rigging. To the other end 9 life buoys were next securely bent in the form of a chain, with a length of about a fathom between the buoys, and finally a long, light heaving line was bent on to the extreme outer end of the warp. The warp was then carefully coiled down on deck, ready for paying out, the buoys piled on the top of it, and the spare part of the heaving line carried out to the flying jib boom end, where it was snugly coiled and stopped ready for use. Our preparations were now complete, and, having meanwhile been plying to windward, the helm was put up, and we wore round to return to the wreck. This operation provided work for us all, including Sir Edgar, and when at length we got the ship round upon the starboard tack we found, to our extreme vexation, that the circle we had made was so large that we should be unable to fetch the wreck. This was terribly annoying at the time when every minute lost might mean a human life, but we could do nothing to rectify the matter except stand on far enough upon the new tack to ensure that when we next wore we should not again undershoot our mark. And if it was vexations for us, what must it have been for the poor fellows who, standing as it were within the very jaws of death, were anxiously watching our every movement? To our eagerness and anxiety the minutes seemed hours, but at length we felt that we had reached far enough to justify another attempt, and upon getting the ship round again we had the satisfaction of seeing that we had measured our distance just right, and should be about able to fetch the wreck, with little or nothing to spare. As we approached the brig, the negro, who, now that he was separated from his late companions, proved himself not only to be a first-rate seaman, but also a very willing, good-natured fellow, most earnestly besought me to entrust to him the task of manipulating the heaving line, vehemently asserting his ability to cast it further and straighter than any of the rest of us, and I accordingly deputed that duty to him. Whereupon he laid out to the flying jib boom end, and placing himself astride the spar, outside the royal stay, clinched himself there in the most extraordinary manner by means of his feet and legs, and then calmly took the coil of heaving line in his hand and held himself ready for a cast. The ease with which the fellow clung to the bare end of that dancing spar was a revelation to me, for the motion out there was proportionately as violent as it would have been in the maintop. Yet there he sat, as composedly as though he had been in an easy chair, while most white men would have found it difficult enough to maintain such a position with the aid of hands as well as feet, leaving out the question of any possibility of executing such a maneuver as that of throwing a line to windward against a whole gale of wind. San Domingo thus safely established at his station, Joe and Sir Edgar placed themselves at the braces, standing by to back the main topsail at the instant that I should give the word, while I climbed into the weather fore-rigging as the best position from which to con the ship, and in this order we edged gradually and warily down toward the wreck. End of chapter 19. Recorded by Marty on the Central Coast of California.
Chapter 20 of The Cruise of the Esmeralda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn Spiegel. The Cruise of the Esmeralda by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 20. The End of the Adventure. Our situation, now, was everything that could be desired for the execution of the delicate maneuver that I contemplated, and only a few minutes elapsed from the time of my stationing myself in the fore-rigging when the critical moment arrived for us to attempt it. I accordingly signalled to Forbes to put the helm down, which he instantly did, lashing it fast, when he and I sprang simultaneously to the weather main braces to assist Sir Edgar and Joe in backing the main topsail. This proved to be a tough drag for 4 men, but we managed to get the yards round far enough to lay the sail aback, when once more I darted forward into the fore-rigging to superintend the remainder of the work, Forbes returning to his station at the wheel, while Sir Edgar and Joe stood by the warp, in readiness to pay it out quickly and to throw the life buoys over clear of the rail. Everything now depended upon the strength and skill of San Domingo. The wreck, when I reached my post of observation in the rigging, was on our weather bow, not more than twice our own length from us, and the Barque, with her way already somewhat retarded by the backing of the main topsail and the putting down of the helm, was slowly forging up to it, with her bows inclining toward the exact spot where 9 men were still huddled together in the main rigging, anxiously watching our approach and wondering what we were about to do. They saw that San Domingo was preparing to heave them a rope's end, but that did not very greatly enlighten them until Joe and Sir Edgar each raised a life buoy to the rail and prepared to throw it overboard. Then they got an inkling of our intent, and a feeble shout went up from among them. Slowly, and more slowly still, the Barque continued to forge ahead, and I began to fear that, in my anxiety to avoid an actual collision with the wreck, I had backed my topsail a second or two too soon, and that we should not, after all, get near enough to her to accomplish the rescue. Still, we had not wholly lost our way, and foot by foot, or rather inch by inch, we continued to creep nearer and nearer to the wreck, until the negro, on the end of his spar, was soaring and swooping wildly within some 50 feet of the group of half-drowned men, and then our way stopped. That was the moment that San Domingo had been waiting for. Watching his opportunity, he seized upon the instant when the wreck and ourselves were both sunk in the trough of a sea, and therefore comparatively sheltered from the wind, when, with a single powerful swing of the coil round his head, he sent it whizzing straight and fair in among the group who were anxiously waiting for it. "Get as far aft as you can, and then haul away upon the line," I shouted. One of them waved his hand to signify that he understood what I wanted, and then they all took hold of the line, and, with it grasped firmly in their hands, made their way cautiously in toward the hull, we watching their movements, meanwhile in a state of the most intense anxiety and suspense. For now that we were within a biscuit toss of them, the appalling precariousness and the peril of their situation became fully apparent to us. More completely so, indeed, than it probably was to the unfortunate fellows themselves. For, huddled together as they were in the rigging, they were sheltered to some extent by the hull of the brig, and were thus unable to clearly see and measure the stupendous proportions of the vast roaring mountains of foam-capped water that came hissing and swooping down upon them from to windward, each huge comber seemingly sentient and with a full determination to overwhelm and engulf the already stricken and helpless fabric that lay prone and waterlogged at their mercy, while we, from the superior elevation of our buoyant deck, could look over and beyond the nearly submerged hull, and watch with breathless anxiety the swoop of every giant wave as it surged down upon the wreck, and buried her in a blinding smoother of seething, milk-white foam. But, beaten down, inert, and waterlogged as was the brig, her cargo was evidently of such a character as to impart a considerable measure of buoyancy to her, for though every sea that broke over her completely buried her for the moment, she invariably reappeared on the hinder slope of the baffled comber, apparently little or none the worse for her momentary submergence. Her triumphant survival, indeed, of these continuous and overwhelming onslaughts soon convinced me that her crew had little to fear from the prospect of her speedy foundering. Their danger lay not in any such probability, but consisted in the likelihood of their being torn from their precarious hold in the rigging by every sea that swept and raged over them. The danger was, of course, greatly increased when the men began to move inward toward the hull, thus more fully exposing themselves to the fury of every surge that swept over it. And of this fact we soon had a most painful and melancholy illustration, for as the group, after waiting for 2 or 3 minutes for a favorable opportunity, essayed to scramble out of the rigging and make their way aft along the brig's upturned side to her quarter, where they would be clear of the gear and rigging when they took to the water. A small and comparatively innocuous sea broke over the hull, which, harmless as it was compared with most of its predecessors, had still enough of weight and spite in it to sweep one of the poor fellows from his precarious foothold into the seething, hissing swirl to leeward. The man tossed his arms over his head, with a wild shriek for help, as the smoother carried him along in its suffocating embrace, and Joe promptly made a spring for a spare life-buoy that we had provided for such an emergency. But before it could be thrown, the unfortunate wretch was hurled over the brig's main-yard as it lifted up out of the water, and the next instant he disappeared beneath the foot of the main topsail, the wide spaces of which immediately shut down upon and buried him as the roll of the hull once more submerged her spars. We never saw the poor fellow again, and there is no doubt that, caught and entangled beneath the claws of the topsail, he was drowned there. Meanwhile, we were drifting rapidly away to leeward, and the full length of our warps was almost played out. It was therefore imperative that the men on the wreck should act quickly. I shouted to them to this effect, and, awaking from the momentary stupefaction produced by the painfully sudden loss of their comrade, the remaining 8 men made a dash for the brig's quarter, and succeeded in reaching it just as the vessel was up-hove upon the crest of another tremendous sea. We saw them slip the string of life-buoys over their heads, and the next instant they were buried in the vast volume of water that broke, roaring and hissing, over the fabric that they stood upon. To our anxious minds, it seemed an endless time before they reappeared, but at length we saw the string of life-buoys floating in the midst of the lacework of foam, some 10 fathoms to leeward of the wreck, well clear of the heaving spars and snake-like coils of loose and unrove gear, 8 of the 9 buoys having each a man in it. "Hurrah!" I shouted, swinging myself on deck out of the rigging. "We have them! Haul away gently upon the line, and let us get them alongside." As I spoke, I saw that San Domingo was laying in from the jib boom end, he having, like myself, seen that we had got hold of the men, and presently he ranged up alongside me and, following my example, industriously set to work to throw the coils of braces, halyards, crew lines, and so on off the pins, and bend the ends of them into bowlines in readiness for hauling the rescued men up the side. The task of getting the poor fellows safely inboard was soon accomplished, when, administering to each man a pannikin of scalding hot coffee that had meanwhile been prepared in the galley, I sent them below into the forecastle with instructions to strip, rub each other well down, and turn in until a good meal could be prepared for them, when, the rescued crew being thus temporarily disposed of, we filled upon the ship and resumed our voyage. A good, substantial meal of beef, potatoes, and ship's bread, backed up with a few hours' sleep and a shift into dry clothes, sufficed to set the rescued men upon their pins again, little or nothing the worse for the hardship and exposure they had so recently undergone. And that same evening I obtained from the mate of the brig, a man named Cooper, the particulars of their adventure. From this man's story, it appeared that the brig, a vessel of 174 tons register, named the Golden Gate, hailed from San Francisco, from which port she had sailed in search of a cargo of sandalwood. The quest had been successful, a full cargo had been obtained, and all had gone well with the craft, up to the afternoon of the preceding day, when her crew, like us, had found themselves becalmed. Unlike myself, however, the skipper of the Golden Gate, who proved to be the man who had unfortunately been swept away and lost during the process of rescue, had obstinately refused to believe that the threatening aspect of the weather meant anything worse than a sharp thunderstorm, and had declined to accede to the suggestion of his mate that sail should be shortened, averring that all the wind they were likely to get they would need to help them out of the region of the equatorial calms. The result had been that when the hurricane burst upon them, the ship was hove over and upon her beam ends, with her sails flat upon the water, in which position she had gradually filled, her cargo only preventing the water-logged hull from sinking under the feet of her crew. Fortunately for all hands, they had entertained sufficiently serious doubts of their skipper's judgment to determine them to remain on deck and see the matter out. Hence, when the brig went over, they were in a measure prepared for the catastrophe, and lost no time in clambering on the vessel's upturned side. From this position the sea, breaking heavily over the hull, soon drove them into the rigging, where they had remained, constantly drenched with spray and frequently submerged beneath the vast volumes of water that poured over the wreck, until rescued by us. In exchange for his story, I briefly informed the rescued mate that I had sailed from Sydney, in ballast, for the Canton River, intending to cut a cargo of sandalwood on the way, but that the bulk of my crew, a gang of desperadoes from the gold diggings, had frustrated my purpose by attempting to take my ship away from me, and that I had therefore been compelled to leave them on an island. And further, that when I sighted the Golden Gate, we were on our way to the Sandwich Islands, hoping to there obtain men enough to navigate the barque to China. I said that, if he and his men wished it, I would still go on to Honolulu and land them there, from whence they would doubtless soon find an opportunity to return to San Francisco. Or, if they preferred it, I would ship them all, at the current rate of wages, for the voyage to China, and, if they gave me satisfaction, thence home to England. He said he would lay my offer before the men and acquaint me with their decision forthwith, and at once retired to the forecastle. Whereupon I at once called Joe and San Domingo to me, and laid the strictest injunctions upon them both that under no circumstances whatever were they to make the slightest allusion to the treasure in the hold, hinting pretty strongly that, if they did, their own share of it would probably fall very short of what it would be should the secret be well kept. The caution I believed to be quite needless, so far as Joe was concerned, but its necessity, as regarded the negro, was made quite apparent by his remark when I had finished speaking. "Golly, sar, it's just as well you told me dat in time, otherwise I dead sure to hab said something about it de first time I had a chance. But now dat you has warned me, sar, you may depend absolutely upon my discretion. I wants all de dollars I can get, and I don't feel inclined to share dem with dem men dat has no hand in de saving of dem." The mate soon returned to the deck with the decision of his crew. He informed me that the men were quite unanimous in their desire to leave the ship at Honolulu and make the best of their way back to San Francisco with as little delay as possible, if such an arrangement would accord with my convenience, but that, in the meantime, they would gladly turn in and assist me to work the ship so far, without pay, in acknowledgment of my having saved their lives. The weather, meanwhile, was fast moderating, so much so that during the second dog watch we took a good drag upon the topsail halyards, and set the foresail and mizzen, the wind gradually hauling round further from the northward, and breaking us off until we headed northeast by compass. The mercury was rising almost as rapidly as it had fallen, and there was every prospect of a fine night. Cooper, the late mate of the Golden Gate, offered to do duty as second mate, while the cook of the craft expressed his desire to continue the functions of his office. The remainder of the men declared their readiness to go to work forthwith, and that night, accordingly, we once more kept 2 watches, each consisting of an officer and 4 men, while I, who had been on deck almost continually for 30 hours, turned in and, with a mind intensely relieved by the acquisition of so much valuable help, slept like a log until 7 o'clock the next morning. I awoke of my own accord, and had no sooner opened my eyes than I knew, without any need of telling, exactly how we were situated. The ship was rolling, with a long, steady, even swing from side to side, with an occasional heave and settlement of her quarter as the swell took her. The canvas was alternately flapping out with rifle-like reports, and thundering against her masts as she rolled. The bulkheads were creaking and groaning, the cabin doors were rattling upon their hooks, the wheel chains were clanking as the rudder kicked to the wash and swirl under the counter, and there was a gurgling, dripping wash of water along the bends, without any seething sound in it, that told me, apart from the other noises of the ship, that we were again becalmed. The sun was streaming brilliantly in through the porthole of my cabin, flooding the little apartment with warmth and golden light, and the swishing and scrubbing sounds overhead told me that the hands were busy at the job of washing decks. It was a welcome, joyous sound, as evidence of the fact that we once more had a crew on board us, and I thrust my feet into my slippers and went on deck to get my morning bath with a feeling of gaiety and blithesomeness that taught me, for the first time, how heavy had been the load of anxiety that I had lately borne, and that had slipped from my shoulders with the arrival of the Golden Gate crew on board. It was a glorious morning, with a clear, brilliantly blue, cloudless sky overhead, out of which the sun, though only an hour high, already blazed with an ardor that gave promise of a scorching day. The sea was oil smooth, with a glittering sheen like that of quicksilver in the wake of the sun, while away to the westward of us it flashed and gleamed in hues of the softest, purest, opalescent blue to the side of the ship with the running of the swell. There was not a breath of wind, nor the remotest sign of any, so I ordered the lighter canvas and the courses to be hauled down and clewed up to save them from thrashing themselves to rags, and, having revelled in the luxury of a shower bath of cool, sparkling brine from the hose, left the ship under the topsails and top foremast staysail, and went below to dress for breakfast. The calm that had now fallen upon us lasted unbroken for 5 full days, during which we sweltered, day and night, in the melting heat of the tropics, with the blazing sun right overhead every day at noon, and a waning moon soaring into the heavens later and still later each night, to render the hours of darkness magical with the witchery of her beauty and mystery. And during the whole of this time we never shifted our position by so much as a single mile a day. At length, however, on the 6th day, a few cat's paws came playing at intervals over the surface of the glass-smooth water, momentarily ruffling it into little evanescent patches of tender blue, and causing a transient ripple to play over the stagnant claws of our canvas. As the day wore on, the cat's paws increased in frequency, in area, and in strength, and shortly before sundown a gentle, dainty little air of wind came stealing softly up from the eastward, to woo which we joyfully spread every rag of canvas we could show to it, and oh, how ineffably pleasant and delightful was the sound of the first faint liquid tinkling ripple that broke from our cutwater, and gushed gently past the bends in a stream of tiny bursting air bubbles, as the beautifully moulded hull yielded to the faint impulse of the soft breathing and began to move under it with the languorous motion of a sleeping swan. Then, as the soft, warm, star-spangled darkness of the tropics closed down upon us and wrapped us within its impalpable folds, the breeze gathered strength and weight by imperceptible degrees, until the scarcely audible tinkle under the bows merged into the sound of a knife shearing through a tautly stretched silken web, with a musical fountain-like plashing at the cutwater and a crisp, gushing curl of the glassy wave under the lee bow as it broke and hurried past into our wake in a lacework of creamy, swirling froth, gemmed with countless glittering foam bubbles, while the log told us that the ship was slipping her way through the small wrinklings of the brine at a speed of fully 6 knots in the hour. By and by the moon, her orb now reduced to less than half its full dimensions, stole ghost-like above the horizon, and by her wan light we saw that a host of soft, fleecy clouds, shaped like the smoke belched from the mouth of a cannon upon a windless day, were mustering their squadrons in the eastern quarter, and we knew them for the welcome trade cloud, the sure indication that the breeze we now had would be a lasting one. And so it proved, for the fleecy masses soared upward until they overspread the whole of the visible sky, and as they soared so the breeze hardened, until at length, by the time that the middle watch drew toward its close, the saucy Esmeralda, with the wind well over her starboard quarter, and everything packed upon her, from the royal studding sails down, was storming through it at a pace nearer to 16 than 15 knots in the hour, while the wild, weird melody of 100 harps singing through the taut mazes of her rigging aloft mingled with the roar of the wind out of the great spaces of her straining canvas, and the deep, continuous thunder of the bow wave, raising a concert of such mad, soul-stirring harmony as causes the sailor's heart to leap and bound within him in ecstatic exultation, to the swift, buoyant leaps and plunges of the good ship beneath him. This truly royal breeze continued to blow with scarcely diminished strength, enabling us to reel off our 15 knots per hour for hours at a time, while our speed seldom sank below 12, the result of which was that a little before midnight of the 5th day from its first reaching us, we glided into the roadstead of Honolulu and came to an anchor. On the following morning, immediately after breakfast, I went ashore, taking with me my passengers and Cooper, the mate of the Golden Gate, and while Sir Edgar with his party made their way to the best hotel in the place, preparatory to the planning of an expedition which would permit of their seeing as much as possible of the beauties of the island during our stay there, Cooper and I sought out our respective counsels. Neither of them were difficult to find, and while I partook of a second breakfast with our honourable British representative, I learnt from him, after telling him as much of my story as I deemed needful, that an Aberdeen ship had unfortunately driven ashore and gone to pieces there only a fortnight previously, and that her crew were then awaiting an opportunity to work their way home, the master and chief mate having already left for England via San Francisco upon a steamer. Upon further inquiry, I found that there were 13 of the crew in all, namely, the second mate, steward, cook, and 10 seamen. This suited me exactly, for although there were more men than I really needed, we had accommodation for an even greater number in the Esmeralda's roomy forecastle and deck-house. Moreover, I had had all that I wanted of such an unpleasant experience as that of being short-handed. I therefore determined to ship them all, if they were willing, and recompense myself for my recent hardships by enjoying the luxury of a fully manned ship. The men were easily found, were indeed on the lookout for me, having learned early in the morning that an English barque had arrived in the roadstead some time during the night, and upon interviewing them I learned that they were, one and all, most anxious to make a start for home. They were as quiet, sober, and steady-looking a crew as I could possibly desire to meet with, or have under me. I therefore shipped the whole of them, on the spot, and directed them to hold themselves in readiness to join the ship as soon as they should receive instructions from me to that effect. Meanwhile, Cooper had an interview with his counsel, the result of which was an arrangement that the crew of the Golden Gate should land forthwith, as there were several American vessels in the port, and, consequently, ample facilities for dispatching the men home. As a consequence of this, the Americans left the Esmeralda that same afternoon, while the new crew went on board and took up their quarters on the following morning. The luncheon hour had arrived by the time that all these arrangements were completed, and I therefore hastened away to Sir Edgar's hotel for the double purpose of satisfying a certain inward craving that had already begun to make itself felt, and of acquainting the baronet with the character of the business upon which I had been engaged during the morning. The several members of the party were, naturally enough, much pleased to learn that there was to be no undue detention among the lovely Sandwich Islands, but, on the other hand, they expressed so earnest a desire to see something of Oahu, now that they were actually upon it, that I cheerfully consented to delay my departure until the evening of the 3rd day. A tour of the island was thereupon arranged, in which I was very cordially invited to join, and a most delightful excursion was the result. But as this is not a guide-book, and nothing out of the ordinary way occurred during its progress, I will not inflict the details of it upon the indulgent reader. Upon our return to the ship we found that Forbes, following my instructions, had re-watered her, and laid in a generous supply of fruit, pigs, poultry, and other necessaries. Our crew were all on board, and there was nothing to detain us any longer in this Pacific paradise. We therefore got our anchor forthwith, and stood out of the roadstead in the crimson wake of the setting sun, just as that luminary sank magnificently beneath the horizon, painting the whole western sky with the flaming hues of his dying effulgence. There is but little more to tell, for the rescue of the Golden Gate crew proved to be the last adventure that befell us on this extraordinarily eventful voyage. We made a very rapid run across to the China coast, and were detained but a short time in the Canton River, freights happening to be rather high and tonnage somewhat scarce, for a wonder, about the time of our arrival. I therefore met with no difficulty in obtaining a freight, with quick dispatch, and within 3 weeks of our arrival we were once more at sea, this time homeward bound. I must not forget to mention, by the way, that almost my first act upon arriving at Hong Kong was to write home 2 somewhat lengthy letters, one to my mother, acquainting her with the successful result of my quest, together with a full and detailed narrative of my adventures since leaving Sydney, and the other to my old and trusty friend, Mr. Richards, acquainting him also with my success, and requesting him to undertake certain rather delicate negotiations for me, as well as to make certain preparations against the time of the Esmeralda's arrival in the English Channel. Our homeward passage was as prosperous as it was uneventful. We were no sooner clear of our moorings than we caught a favourable breeze that followed us all the way until we had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and had caught the south-east trades, which in their turn carried us right up to, and indeed a few miles to the north of, the line. Here we met with the usual light, baffling airs, with plenty of rain and perhaps rather more than the average allowance of thunder and lightning. But this weather lasted only a trifle over 48 hours, when a small easterly air came to our rescue and fanned us along to the northward until we finally fell in with the northeast trades, the beneficent influence of which carried us as far north as the parallel of 28 degrees. Here again kind fortune favoured us, for when at length the trade winds failed us, the wind gradually hauled round from the southward, and thence from the westward and northwest, hardening all the time, until at length it blew quite a fresh gale, which sent us bowling and staggering away to the northward and eastward under single-reefed topsails, with top-gallant sails over them, reeling off our 14 knots hour after hour, and enabling us to hold our own for a whole day with one of the West Indian mail-boats, homeward bound, much, no doubt, to the chagrin and astonishment of her officers. The breeze continued to freshen, however, and the sea to rise, necessitating first the handling of our top-gallant sails, and, a little later on, the further reefing down of our topsails, when the great steamer gradually drew away from us, and by next morning was out of sight. This slant lasted us for 4 days, when the wind gradually softened into a moderate sailing breeze, veering all the time until it finally worked round from the southward once more, bringing with it mild, genial, sunshiny weather that carried us right up the channel to Portland Roads, which we entered on a lovely summer evening, 9 months, almost to a day, from the date upon which we had quitted it at the commencement of the voyage. I was, of course, careful to have the ship's number and burgee conspicuously displayed as we entered the roadstead, and I also observed the precaution of standing far enough over towards the Weymouth side of the bay to permit of the flags being distinctly made out before bringing the ship to an anchor, the result of which was that, before the canvas was well clewed up, a small steam launch emerged from Weymouth harbour, and in due time deposited my dear mother and my very good friend Mr. Richards upon the Esmeralda's deck. Of the joyous meeting that ensued, of my dear mother's smiles and tears and caresses and ejaculations of gratitude at my safe return, and of Mr. Richards' hearty congratulations at my successful achievement, I will say nothing. The picture may very well be left to the vivid imagination of the reader. I need only to state that, after the first bustle and excitement of the meeting had passed over, Mr. Richards drew me carefully aside and remarked, "It is all right, my dear boy. Everything is arranged. I have put the whole affair into the hands of Tom White, a man whom I would trust with my very life, and he will come off to you with a half-dozen larents and a strong gang of thoroughly reliable men at 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. Hand over your cases of treasure to him without hesitation, and he will take care of them for you. He knows exactly how to manage the business. Trust him, for he was a smuggler in his youth, when smuggling was still a paying business, as were his forebears, for generations before him. So it is in the man's blood, you see." And as Mr. Richards had said, so it proved. The night was, luckily, very dark, and therefore exactly suited to our purpose, and promptly at 2 o'clock the man White, with his fleet of larets, came gliding noiselessly along out of the darkness, and in less than half an hour every ounce of the treasure was out of the ship, with nobody a bit the wiser. The next morning a man came alongside offering crabs for sale, and before leaving the ship he slipped a crumpled dirty piece of notepaper, smelling strongly of fish, into my hand, upon opening which I, with some difficulty, deciphered the following communication: "Dear Sir, the boxes be all right, yours to command, T. White." Is there anything else to tell? Well, yes. There is just one further item of information that may interest some at least of my readers. I remember remarking, in the course of my narrative, that toward the latter part of my acquaintance with Miss Merivale, dating particularly from the capture and recapture of the ship at the Treasure Island, that very charming young lady's demeanor toward me underwent a certain subtle, indefinable, puzzling, but exceedingly agreeable change. And after we had left China and were on our homeward voyage, when, in short, I had leisure to give a proper amount of thought and attention to so important a matter, I determined to ascertain what it meant. Now, this is not a love story, so I will not enter into the particulars of how I first of all fell to questioning myself as to why this change of manner should have proved so agreeable to me, nor will I describe the mental process by which I quickly arrived at the conclusion that it was because Agnes Merivale was, beyond all question, the sweetest and most lovable, as well as the most charming and lovely woman it had ever been my good fortune to encounter. Nor will I attempt to describe the devious methods and the complicated stratagems by which, having arrived at this conclusion, I painfully sought to obtain some slight inkling or clue to the sweet girl's sentiments toward myself. Let it suffice to say that they were all signally, miserably unsuccessful. You, my dear reader, would of course have managed infinitely better. I am well aware of that. But remember, if you please, that I was only a plain, unpolished sailor, a man who, maybe, could handle a ship fairly well, take care of her in a gale of wind, and navigate her successfully from port to port, but who had until now had no experience of women and their ways. Moreover, I would have cut off my right hand rather than have said or done anything to offend one of the sex worthy the name of woman. So, for the first time in my life, I was fairly nonplussed and unhappy, knowing full well what I wanted, but not knowing what steps I ought to take in order to ensure myself a fair chance of obtaining it. Such a state of mind, however, is not likely to be long tolerated by a sailor. My good sense came to my aid, and whispered that if my love loved me, I had only to give her the opportunity to say so, and all would be well. So one night, how well I remember it, it was pitch dark, and we were just clear of the Straits of Sunda, rolling merrily along before a fresh easterly breeze, under every rag that we could pack upon the ship. I got the dear girl to myself for a while up on the poop, and told her in simple, sailorly language exactly what were my feelings and hopes. We were promenading the poop together, arm in arm, while I spoke, and she heard me to the end without a word. Then she stopped, and placing both her hands in mine, said, with an unmistakable quiver of emotion in her voice, "Thank you, Jack, for the most priceless gift a man can offer a woman, the gift of a loyal, loving heart. I accept it gratefully, dear, and will do my best to make you happy, for I believe I have loved you from the very first, my darling." The End. End of The Cruise of the Esmeralda by Harry Collingwood.